welcome. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the darkness be a blanket. Before our journey into the shadows begins tonight, I have a small request. In the comments below, tell me what time it is and what city, town, or corner of the world you're listening from. I like to imagine our stories creating a web, connecting us all in the quiet hours, a single digital campfire in the vast, silent dark. And if these tales resonate with you, a simple like is always deeply appreciated. And subscribing to the channel ensures you'll never miss our nightly gatherings. Now, close your eyes. Let my voice be your only guide. The stories are waiting. First story: The Man Who Forgot the Color Blue. Arthur Finch was a man sculpted by precision. His world was a perfectly catalogued library, each thought a book meticulously placed on a shelf, each sensation a dog-eared page awaiting its proper index. He found solace in order, in the reliable hum of systems that kept chaos at bay. As a senior librarian, his days unfolded with the quiet dignity of turning pages, the rustle of old paper, the hushed reverence for words bound in leather and cloth. His flat, a modest, well-organized affair, mirrored his professional life, every item possessing its assigned place, every corner free from the dust motes of uncertainty. Arthur loved the predictable arc of his existence, the soft clatter of his morning teacup, the precise angle at which the sunbeams pierced his kitchen window at precisely 7:17 a.m. It was on one such morning, a Tuesday by the internal clock he relied upon more than any timepiece, that the first subtle tremor registered. He awoke, not to the usual cascade of sensory information, but to a curious, almost imperceptible void. The sky, glimpsed through his window, was not its usual self. It was absent, a flat, expansive nothingness, a colorless expanse that lacked any distinct quality. He blinked, rubbing at his eyes, convinced it was a trick of the light, perhaps an uncharacteristic early fog. But as he stood, making his way to the kitchen, the unsettling sensation persisted. His favorite mug, the one with the delicate floral pattern, seemed somehow incomplete. The small ceramic vase on his windowsill, usually a vibrant accent, now presented itself as a dull, indistinct shade. He felt a word, a concept, hovering just beyond the grasp of his consciousness, a phantom limb of language. It was a word that described a certain quality, a pervasive hue that had, until this very moment, been an inherent part of his perception. He tried to articulate it, to pluck it from the labyrinthine corridors of his mind, but it slipped away like mist. It wasn't that he saw things as a different color. It was as if the idea of that color, its very essence, had been surgically excised from his cognitive framework. The world wasn't suddenly tinted red or green where this missing color should be. No, it was merely gone. The space it once occupied was now a blank, a silent omission in the symphony of light. He walked to work, his meticulous steps now accompanied by a growing disquiet. The advertisements on the buses, the shirts of passers-by, the signs above shops, all seemed to participate in this subtle, terrifying amputation. The usual vibrancy of the city had been muted, a masterpiece with a significant portion erased, leaving behind an unsettling patchwork of what remained. He arrived at the library, the familiar scent of old paper and dust, a momentary comfort. Yet even here, the missing concept cast a pall. The spine of his most treasured first edition, an antique volume of maritime history, appeared flat, its distinctive shade now a nondescript gray. The globe in the children's section, a vibrant swirl of continents and oceans, now depicted the vast expanses of water as a featureless, dull expanse, like polished pewter. He spent the day in a quiet, internal panic, meticulously cross-referencing, searching for something, anything, that might jog the absent word. He consulted dictionaries, art history texts, books on optics and perception. He read descriptions of distant oceans, of clear skies, of forget-me-nots and blueberries. The words were there: azure, sapphire, navy. But they were hollow, stripped of their meaning. They pointed to nothing. He could read the letters, pronounce the sounds, but the inherent understanding, the direct, immediate connection to the sensory experience, was utterly, chillingly absent. It was like reading a description of a flavor he had never tasted and could not even conceive. That night, sleep offered no true escape. He dreamed in muted tones, a landscape drained of a vital component, a silent film playing out in monochrome, where once there had been full spectrum. He woke the next morning with a heavy sense of dread, a premonition of further unraveling. He brewed tea, the methodical ritual offering little comfort. As he stepped onto his small balcony to survey the morning, another absence pricked at his awareness. The rain. It wasn't raining, but the memory of rain, of its unique scent, that earthy, clean, almost metallic aroma that precedes and accompanies a downpour, was gone. Not merely forgotten, but erased. He could recall the idea of rain, the visual of droplets, the sound of their patter, but the olfactory sensation, the very concept of the smell of rain, was no longer accessible. He tried to conjure it, to imagine that distinct petrichor, but his mind offered only a blank space, a sensory void. He realized, with a sickening lurch, that this was not just about color. This was a systematic dismantling. He began to document the losses, a desperate attempt to impose order on the encroaching chaos. In a small, leather-bound notebook, he meticulously listed what had vanished: the concept of blue, color, the smell of rain. The act of writing offered a fleeting sense of control, a fragile barrier against the tide of obliteration. Each entry was a tombstone for a part of his world. Days bled into weeks, each sunrise bringing with it a fresh, chilling subtraction. First, it was the feeling of warmth. He could register temperature. The thermometer on his wall still indicated degrees, but the inherent, comforting sensation of warmth, the very concept of it, evaporated. A hot bath became merely less cold. A comforting blanket was simply a physical weight. The sun on his skin was a pressure, a source of light, but the pervasive, embracing sensation of its warmth was an echo of something he no longer understood. He shivered, not from cold, but from the chilling knowledge that a fundamental human experience had been plucked from his being. Then came the sounds. Not all sounds, not at once, but specific ones, subtle nuances that, once gone, left the auditory landscape strangely incomplete. The rustle of dry leaves underfoot, for instance. He could hear the crunch, the friction, but the distinct, papery whisper of rustle as a specific quality, that specific sound profile, faded. The chirping of a cricket became a mere series of clicks, devoid of its melodic, summer night essence. He found himself listening intently, straining to hear what wasn't there, a phantom orchestra playing out in silence. The most terrifying losses, however, were yet to come. They began subtly, a blurring at the edges of his personal history. He was looking at an old photograph, a faded image of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. It was his mother. He knew it was his mother. Her name, her relationship to him, these facts remained. But her face, the intimate contours, the unique lines and expressions that made it hers, the very memory of her specific countenance began to dissolve. It wasn't that he couldn't see the image. It was that the rich, textured recall of her face, distinct from any other, was being meticulously sanded away. It became a generic female face, then just a face, and then, most horrifyingly, a blank space where a face should be. The process was insidious, painless, and complete. There was no struggle against the fading, no agonizing stretch for what was lost. It simply ceased to exist within him. One moment, the concept was there, part of the fabric of his understanding. The next, it was gone, leaving behind only the unnerving absence, a hole in his mental tapestry. He realized that this was the true terror, not the pain of loss, but the complete, silent erasure. How could he mourn what he could no longer conceive? How could he fight a thief who took not his possessions, but his very means of recognizing them? His notebook became a chronicle of his diminishing self. The concept of blue color, the smell of rain, the feeling of warmth, the specific sound of rustling leaves, the specific memory of mother's face. Each entry was a step further into an ever-shrinking world. He tried to imagine his childhood home, but the warm, inviting glow of the living room, the scent of his grandmother's baking, the specific creak of the third step on the staircase, all these sensory memories, these anchors to his past, began to unravel. The house became a schematic, a floor plan without atmosphere, without life. His meticulousness, once his comfort, became his torment. He tried to organize the remaining fragments of his mind, to categorize the voids, but even the concept of categorization itself began to fray. The precise meaning of order, structure, logic started to feel distant, like words heard through a thick pane of glass. He would arrange books on a shelf, then look at them moments later, wondering why he had done so, the rationale for his actions having vanished into the growing emptiness. He stopped going to work. The library, once his sanctuary, became a bewildering maze of objects whose purpose he increasingly failed to grasp. How could he classify books about the sea when the very idea of its boundless, captivating blue had been erased from his being? How could he recommend a book on a spring day when the fresh, vibrant scent of rain and blooming flowers was no longer a concept he could hold? His colleagues, concerned, visited him. He would smile, nod, utter polite platitudes, but their faces, their voices, their very presence began to blur into a generalized other, their specific identities dissolving into a featureless humanity. The fear, once a sharp, distinct emotion, also began to soften, to lose its edge. It didn't vanish entirely, but its specific, visceral quality diminished. It became a dull ache, a vague unease, rather than a gripping terror. This was perhaps the cruelest irony of all. As his world crumbled, so too did his capacity to fully react to its collapse. He was becoming less, not just in terms of what he knew, but in terms of who he was capable of being. One morning, he woke. He looked at his hand, tracing the lines on his palm. He knew it was his hand. He knew it belonged to him. But the concept of me, of Arthur Finch, the culmination of a life lived, a personality forged, experiences gathered, that too was beginning to wane. He tried to grasp it, to hold on to the essence of his individuality. But it was like trying to hold smoke. His memories, once neatly shelved, were now scattered, their labels faded, their contents dissolving into an undifferentiated past. His childhood, his career, his small moments of joy and quiet sorrow, they were all becoming a featureless expanse, a gray canvas upon which no image could adhere. He stood by the window, looking out at the world. The sky was a pale, indistinct expanse. The trees outside were green, he supposed, though the vibrant, distinct idea of green as a specific color, rather than just a different shade from the indefinite, not blue, was also becoming tenuous. The faint scent of exhaust fumes from the street below was merely a sensation in his nose, devoid of any specific odor profile. The gentle breeze that brushed against his skin was merely a moving air current, its refreshing coolness, its very breeziness, a concept slowly departing. He reached for his notebook, his last remaining anchor. He opened it, his fingers tracing the last entry. The specific memory of Mother's face, the distinct quality of rustling leaves, the feeling of warmth, the smell of rain, the concept of blue. He stared at the words, at the phantom limbs of his consciousness. He understood the letters, the grammar, the syntax, but the full, resonant meaning behind them, the rich tapestry of experience they once represented, was no longer his. The void was almost complete. He was a meticulous librarian, cataloging a library that was systematically being emptied, a silent, painless apocalypse of the self. He felt a profound, quiet absence, a growing stillness within. And as the last sliver of understanding, the very concept of loss itself began to recede, there was only the quiet hum of nothingness and the gentle, eternal silence. Second story, the night janitor and the third floor. Arthur Jenkins wasn't looking for grand adventures or a late life career resurgence. He was looking for quiet, for steady work, and for a place where the floor wax still smelled of citrus and pine, not of stale beer and desperation. When the ad for a night janitor at the brand new Zenith corporate tower appeared, he'd felt a cautious flicker of optimism. The building was a monument to modern minimalism, glass, steel, and stark white walls. Its emptiness, particularly after dark, was precisely what appealed to Arthur. His routine settled quickly into a comforting rhythm. 7 p.m., sharp. Clock in, don the sensible gray jumpsuit, grab the cart laden with brushes, mops, and the soft hum of the industrial vacuum. He'd start on the top floor, 22, working his way down. Each night was a mirror of the last, reflecting the pristine, unblemished surfaces back at him. The air conditioning hummed a constant, low note, a sound so pervasive it was less a noise and more a quality of the silence. Desks, precisely aligned, held screens that glowed with a faint, residual warmth long after their occupants had gone. Arthur would dust them with a soft cloth, empty waste bins that rarely held more than a crumpled memo or a solitary coffee cup, and buff the polished concrete floors to a mirror sheen. It was methodical, meditative work. He liked it. Then there was the third floor. Officially, it was unoccupied, not leased, not yet fitted out for tenants. Arthur had been told it was a shell space awaiting future development. When he'd first entered, he'd expected exposed wires and rough concrete. Instead, it was an exact replica of every other floor, just blank. Rows upon rows of identical, sleek desks, each draped in a sterile, translucent plastic sheet, like a silent army awaiting its deployment. The chairs, ergonomic and imposing, were tucked neatly beneath. It was a showroom of potential, a ghost of an office yet to be born. Yet every single night, without fail, on the same desk, in the precise middle of the third row from the windows, Arthur would find it. A coffee ring. Not a dry, forgotten stain, crusted with the dust of days, but a fresh, dark circle, still slightly damp, as if someone had just lifted their mug moments before he arrived. It was always the same desk, always the same size ring, always unmistakably recent. The first time, he'd dismissed it. A previous shift, a worker from another crew, perhaps a ghost of the construction team, forgot their cup. He'd wiped it away with a damp cloth, the dark liquid dissolving into nothingness, leaving the polished surface as unblemished as if it had never been. But it happened again the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. A perfect, wet circle, stubbornly reappearing on the same vacant desk, beneath the same sterile plastic sheet. He started checking his watch, timing his arrival at the third floor. He even tried to vary his route, coming from the service elevator or taking the stairs, anything to catch someone, anyone, in the act. But the third floor was always silent, always empty, always waiting. And the stain was always there, a fresh, dark punctuation mark on the pristine white. He consulted his supervisor, a man named Henderson, whose primary concern seemed to be budget sheets and the proper disposal of hazardous waste. Arthur tried to keep his tone casual. Just a quick question about the third floor, Mr. Henderson. Is anyone ever up there? I keep finding a coffee stain on one of the desks. Henderson barely looked up from his tablet. Third floor? No, Arthur. Shell space. Nobody assigned. Probably residual from the fit-out crew. Just clean it. No fuss. He waved a dismissive hand. Arthur nodded, but the explanation felt thin, like stretched cling film. Residual? For weeks? Fresh every night? No, that wasn't right. A slow, creeping amusement began to replace his initial confusion. It was a phantom coffee drinker, a meticulous, punctual specter who preferred the quiet solitude of an unleased office. One night, feeling a little mischievous, Arthur found a spare sticky note. He pressed it down next to the dark ring. In neat block letters, he wrote, "Good coffee tonight?" The next night, the stain was there, as expected. The note was gone, not moved, not crumpled, just utterly absent. The desk was clean, except for the new, dark circle. Arthur stared. A faint shiver traced its way down his spine. His amusement wavered, replaced by a prickle of unease. He wrote another note. "Did you take my note? Please leave yours if you did." Again, the note vanished. Again, a fresh coffee ring appeared. It was like a silent, one-sided conversation, played out in the sterile echo chamber of the third floor. Arthur's skin began to crawl. The humor had drained out of it, leaving a cold, hollow space. He started to feel watched, even though the surveillance cameras were clearly visible, blinking their red eyes from the corners of the ceiling. He knew they were there. He knew they were fixed. He knew they showed nothing but empty corridors and his own slow, methodical progress. He started examining the stain more closely. It wasn't just a ring. Sometimes, if he looked hard enough, if the light caught it just right, it seemed to have a faint, almost imperceptible smudge, like a finger had dragged across it. Not enough to form a letter, but enough to hint at an intention. He found himself lingering on the third floor, his ears straining against the ever-present hum of the building. He heard the distant rush of water in the pipes, the faint groan of the building settling, the almost imperceptible whisper of air through the vents. But never a footstep, never a cough, never the clink of a mug being placed on a desk. The dread started to curl in his stomach like a cold serpent. It wasn't just a joke anymore. It was an intrusion, a deliberate act in his carefully constructed world of order and solitude. He began to feel a peculiar defiance. He was the janitor. This was his building, his domain. At night, he wouldn't be chased off by a phantom coffee drinker. One particularly still Tuesday night, as the city lights twinkled like scattered jewels outside the vast windows, Arthur found himself on the third floor. The familiar desk, the familiar fresh coffee ring. He'd prepared for this. He pulled out a crisp, new sticky note. His hand, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he wrote. His question was no longer playful, but tinged with a desperate plea for understanding. Who are you? Why are you here? He smoothed the note down, pressing it firmly next to the dark circle. He stood there for a long moment, waiting, listening. The silence was absolute, save for the building's ubiquitous hum. He finished his rounds, his gaze returning to the third floor's door as he descended, half expecting to see it open, to hear something. Nothing. The next night, his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs as the elevator doors whispered open on the third floor. He forced himself to walk slowly, deliberately, down the pristine aisle. He approached the desk. The note was gone, of course. His breath caught in his throat. But beside where the note had been, sprawling across the sterile white surface, was a new coffee stain. It wasn't a ring. It was a word, formed from the dark, viscous liquid, sprawling slightly as if hastily written, yet undeniably clear against the white. It was a single word. Listen. Arthur froze. Every hair on his arms stood on end. His breath hitched. The word wasn't just a stain. It was a command, a direct answer to his unspoken fear. The liquid glinted faintly in the overhead lights, still fresh, still damp. He could smell the faint, bitter aroma of coffee, stronger than usual, as if the word itself was radiating its essence. He backed away, slowly at first, then more quickly. He felt a primal urge to flee, to run from the sterile, silent floor and its impossible message. He didn't clean the stain. He couldn't. He just backed out of the third floor, hitting the elevator button with a trembling hand, his eyes fixed on the desk until the doors closed, shielding him from the dark, silent word. For the rest of the night, he worked in a fog, his movements automatic, his mind reeling. Listen. What was he supposed to listen to? He thought of the building's hum, the groans, the whispers of air. Had he missed something? Was there a sound beneath the sounds? He didn't sleep well. Images of the dark, sprawling word danced behind his eyelids. The next night, arriving at the tower, he felt a profound sense of dread, mixed with a terrifying curiosity. He had to go back to the third floor. He had to. He forced himself to start his routine on the ground floor, working his way up, prolonging the inevitable. The climb felt endless. Each floor was a hurdle, each sweep of the mop a distraction from the terror awaiting him. When he finally reached the third floor, the door seemed darker, more ominous than usual. He pushed it open, his hand clammy on the cool metal. The stain was gone. The desk was pristine, gleaming. He checked again, frantically. Not a trace. Had he imagined it? Was he losing his mind? The thought was almost as terrifying as the stain itself. He ran his hand over the smooth surface of the desk, feeling for any residue, any hint. Nothing. But then, as his fingers grazed the edge, he felt it. Not on the desk, but on the underside, near the front lip, where it would be hidden from casual view. A small, almost invisible, slickness. He ran his fingertip over it. It was dry now, but the residue was still there. And it was black, like coffee. He knelt, peering under the desk, feeling a strange pull towards the darkness. Nothing. Just the cold, impersonal metal frame. He stood up, bewildered. Then, as he was about to turn away, his gaze drifted to the row of desks behind the one where the stain had always appeared. And then to the row behind that. He'd always focused on that single desk, on that single, persistent anomaly. But now, with the command to listen echoing in his mind, he looked at the entire floor differently. He walked slowly, his footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence, down the third row. He stopped at the fifth desk. Nothing. The sixth. Nothing. He reached the ninth desk, and there, almost imperceptibly, on the edge of the desk, beneath the plastic sheet, was a faint, circular indentation, like a ghost of a coffee ring pressed into the polished surface, so subtle it was almost invisible. He moved to the next desk. Another faint impression. And the next. And the next. Not on the top, but beneath the plastic, like they had been there before the plastic was laid down, like they had been there for a very, very long time. He continued his slow, methodical walk, his eyes now scanning not for fresh stains, but for these ancient, subtle marks. He found them on dozens of desks, not just in rings, but in faint smudges, streaks, and curious, almost geometric patterns. They were nearly imperceptible, requiring the exact angle of light, the perfect tilt of his head to see. It was as if 1,000 ghost meetings had been held here, leaving only the faintest impression of their presence. And then, on a desk in the back corner, tucked away from the main thoroughfare, he saw it. Not an impression, but a faint, translucent mark on the plastic sheet itself. A streak. It looked like a tear, a thin, almost invisible channel, as if something wet had dripped from above and slid down the plastic. It ended in a tiny, almost crystalline bead of dried liquid. He touched it. It was brittle and dissolved to dust on his fingertip. He sniffed. A faint, almost imperceptible metallic scent, like old pennies, mixed with something vaguely earthy. He spent the rest of the night on the third floor, not cleaning, but listening. Really listening. He switched off his vacuum, his cart silent in the corner. He stood in the absolute darkness, turning off the lights section by section, relying only on the faint glow from the city outside the windows. The building hummed. But now, it wasn't just a hum. He started to discern layers within it. A high-pitched whine, almost at the edge of hearing, like distant machinery struggling. A low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate through the very floor beneath his feet. And then, something else. A faint, irregular clicking, like nails tapping on glass. Or perhaps something else entirely. He walked towards the sound, his breath held tight in his chest. It seemed to come from the core of the building, from the elevator shafts, from the ventilation systems. He pressed his ear against the metal of an elevator door. The clicking was louder here, faint but insistent. click, 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 click. It wasn't regular. It had a rhythm, but it was unpredictable, like someone idly tapping their fingers, lost in thought. He felt a cold draft, even though the building was sealed tight, its climate meticulously controlled. It wasn't the artificial chill of air conditioning. It was the deep, raw cold that seeped from something ancient, something buried. He thought of the phrase, "The walls have ears." But what if the walls had voices? What if the building itself was trying to communicate? The sterile, minimalist design, the lack of clutter, the pervasive silence, it wasn't just aesthetics. It was a stage, a blank canvas designed for something else to emerge. He began to notice other things, shadows that seemed to deepen and shift even when there was no movement. The way the light from his headlamp, usually so precise, seemed to diffuse and warp in certain areas, as if the air itself was thicker, heavier. He saw faint, almost iridescent swirls in the polished floor where he had just cleaned, gone the moment he blinked. The coffee stain message had said, "Listen, not look, not find. Listen." He went back to the specific desk. He knelt, placing his ear flat against the cold, smooth surface. He listened, straining. The hum of the building was amplified, roaring in his ear. But beneath it, he thought he heard something else. A faint, almost inaudible scraping. And then, like a sigh, a long, drawn-out exhalation that seemed to originate from within the desk itself, from the very core of the building's materials. He pulled back, his face pale. It was impossible. It had to be his imagination, fueled by exhaustion and fear. But the feeling persisted, a cold, undeniable certainty that he was no longer alone on the third floor. He was sharing it with something that communicated in coffee stains and imperceptible sounds. He finished his shift in a daze. He clocked out, the fluorescent lights of the lobby feeling blindingly harsh after the oppressive gloom of the upper floors. He stumbled out into the cool night air, gasping. The next day, he called in sick. And the day after that. And the day after that. He told his worried neighbor it was the flu. But it wasn't the flu. It was a sickness of the soul, a profound unease that had settled deep in his bones. He knew he had to go back, not because he needed the job, not even because he was brave, but because the command, "Listen," had become an insistent whisper in his mind, growing louder with each passing hour. He felt drawn back to the sterile, silent third floor, to the ghostly stains, to the faint, metallic scent. He felt compelled to finally understand what the building was trying to tell him. When he returned, the dread was a living thing in his gut, but it was accompanied by a strange, almost manic exhilaration. He made his way directly to the third floor. He didn't even bother with his card. He just wanted to stand there, to immerse himself in the pervasive silence, to listen. He went to the usual desk. No coffee stain. Clean. As expected. He closed his eyes. He focused. He breathed in the cold, conditioned air and tried to hear beyond the hum. The faint clicking was still there, the low thrum, and the occasional soft sigh. He opened his eyes, and then he saw it. Not on the desk, not on the plastic sheet, but on the floor, directly beneath the leg of the desk, almost hidden by its shadow, was a faint, almost transparent puddle. It was the same dark, coffee-like liquid, but this time it was not circular. It had pooled into a shape, like a rough, elongated oval, perhaps a foot long. And from its center, emanating slowly, almost lazily, were ripples. Concentric circles spreading outwards, disturbing the still, dark surface. They were too slow, too deliberate for something that had just dripped. They were moving with a strange, internal life. He knelt, mesmerized. The liquid was thick, viscous, and as he watched, the ripples slowed, then stopped. The surface became perfectly still. And then slowly, agonizingly, a tiny, dark bubble formed in the very center of the puddle. It expanded, growing larger, stretching the surface taut. And then, with a faint, almost imperceptible pop, it burst. From the center of the now broken bubble, a faint, almost luminous shimmer rose into the air. It wasn't a gas. It wasn't steam. It was like light, condensed and liquid, shimmering in the cold air. It coiled upwards, slender and sinuous, like a wisp of dark smoke, coalescing into a faint, indistinct shape. Arthur gasped, scrambling backward, bumping into the chair behind him with a loud clatter that shattered the oppressive silence. The shimmering form paused, suspended in the air. It was vague, like a figure made of heat haze, but he felt an undeniable presence emanating from it. Then, from the shimmering form, a whisper. It was not a sound made by vocal cords, but a resonance that seemed to vibrate directly in his skull, bypassing his ears entirely. It was low, drawn out, and filled with an ancient weariness. They are coming, for the sound. The whisper faded, leaving behind an echoing silence that was far more profound than before. The shimmering form dissolved, dissipating into the cold air. The puddle on the floor lost its dark intensity, becoming a dull, inert stain once more. The ripples ceased. Arthur sat on the floor, trembling, his mind a maelstrom of terror and incomprehension. They are coming for the sound. What sound? The hum of the building? The clicking? The sighs? And who was coming? He dragged himself to his feet, his gaze fixed on the spot where the shimmering form had been. He looked at the vast, empty third floor, at the hundreds of sterile desks draped in their plastic shrouds. He looked at the quiet perfection, the deliberate emptiness. And then he understood. The building wasn't just a building. It was a vessel. The third floor wasn't just a shell space. It was a chamber, a listening post. And the coffee, the fresh, impossible coffee, wasn't just a stain. It was a conduit, a message, a warning. He cleaned the floor that night. He cleaned the third floor with a meticulous, almost reverent care. He polished the surface until it gleamed, reflecting his own pale, shaken face back at him. He wiped away the last traces of the dark puddle, not out of duty, but out of a desperate, superstitious need to erase the evidence, to make it disappear. He still works at the Zenith Corporate Tower. Every night, he still goes to the third floor. He still finds the single, fresh coffee ring on the same desk. He still wipes it away. But he no longer leaves notes. He no longer tries to catch anyone. Now, he just listens. He listens to the hum of the building, to the faint clicking, to the low thrum that vibrates through the floor. He listens for the subtle shifts in the air, for the deepening shadows. He listens for the whispered sighs, and he listens for the arrival, for them. He doesn't know who they are, or what the sound truly is, but he knows it's real. He knows it's close, and sometimes, late at night, when the building is at its most silent, Arthur Jenkins, the night janitor, can almost hear it too. A faint, distant music, like a song played on ancient, sorrowful pipes, slowly, inexorably drawing closer. and he cleans, and he waits, and he listens, and he wonders if he'll be there to clean up the final, irreversible stain when they finally arrive. Third story, the seam. Alara loved her showers. They were her ritualistic cleansing, both of body and mind, a steaming, sudsy escape from the day's grime and anxieties. The bathroom mirror would fog, the air would thicken with vapor and the scent of lavender, and for a few precious minutes, the world outside simply ceased to exist. It was in this sacred space, amidst the comforting cascade of hot water, that she first felt it. It was a Monday evening, late, the city outside settling into its nightly hum. Alara was soaping her back, her fingers gliding over skin that she knew intimately, when her fingertips snagged on something. Not a pimple, not a scab, not a crease in her skin from sleep. This was different. It felt like a faint, almost imperceptible line, tracing a path down the very center of her spine. She frowned, pressing a little harder, but her fingers simply slid over it, meeting no resistance, no bump, no indentation. It was as if she were feeling the absence of something rather than its presence, a fleeting, curious sensation. She dismissed it, assuming it was a stray hair caught in the lather, or perhaps a trick of the water flowing over her skin. But the thought, once planted, lingered. After drying off, wrapped in a plush towel, she found herself drawn to the full-length mirror. The steam had mostly dissipated, leaving a clear reflection. She twisted, craning her neck, trying to catch a glimpse of the spot her fingers had found. It took a moment, a tilt of her head, a slight adjustment of the lighting from the vanity. And then she saw it. Running vertically down the center of her back, from just below the nape of her neck to a few inches above her lower spine, was a line. It was so faint, so delicate, it was almost invisible. Not red, not inflamed, not raised. It was merely there, like a whisper on her skin. It appeared to be a perfectly straight, almost impossibly precise line, as if drawn with a ruler by an unseen hand. The skin along it seemed infinitesimally tighter, smoother, somehow different from the surrounding flesh, yet utterly seamless. No scar tissue, no discoloration, no hint of an injury or a cut that had healed. It was a line without a history, a mark without an explanation. Alara reached out, her fingertips tracing its path. There was no pain, not even a flicker of discomfort. Her skin felt perfectly normal, yielding beneath her touch. She pressed, she tugged, she even tried to gently rub it, half expecting it to smudge away like a smudge of dirt, or perhaps dissolve like a faint stain. But it remained, unyielding, perfectly, unnervingly still. She showered every day, sometimes twice. How had she never noticed it before? Had it always been there? A chill, not from the cooling air, ran down her arms. The next morning, the line was still there, and the morning after that, and the one after that. Alara found herself obsessively checking it, contorting herself in front of the mirror, turning her back to the light, then away from it, trying to catch it at different angles. In certain lights, it vanished completely, becoming truly invisible. In others, it stood out with an almost luminous quality, a fine, silver thread against her skin. It was unsettling in its perfection, in its stark, unnatural precision. She tried to rationalize it. A peculiar birthmark, perhaps? But she'd never had one on her back. A stretch mark? No, it wasn't wide enough, nor did it have the telltale texture of stretched skin. A faint scar from some forgotten childhood tumble? Impossible. It was too straight, too clean, too perfect. A week later, the nagging unease pushed her to make an appointment with her general practitioner, Dr. Aris. The office was bright, clinical, smelling faintly of antiseptic and coffee. Elara felt foolish as she explained her concern, her voice sounding oddly strained as she described an invisible seam on her back. Dr. Aris, a kind woman with perpetually tired eyes, listened patiently, a faint, professional smile on her face. "All right, Elara, let's have a look," she said, her tone reassuringly neutral. Elara pulled up her shirt, turning her back to the doctor. Dr. Aris leaned in, her glasses glinting under the examination room lights. She poked, she prodded, she ran a gloved finger along the length of the line. She murmured. "Yes, I see what you mean. It's very faint, almost translucent." She took out a small magnifying glass, examining the skin more closely. Elara held her breath, waiting for a diagnosis, a medical term, anything that would bring it into the realm of the explainable. "It appears to be a unique type of dermal line," Dr. Aris finally concluded, straightening up. "Essentially, a very subtle variation in the skin's texture or pigmentation. Some people have very prominent birthmarks, others have barely discernible ones. This is simply a particularly fine example of the latter. Nothing to worry about, completely benign. Just a very unique birthmark, Elara." She patted Elara's shoulder, a gesture meant to convey dismissal and reassurance. If it starts to itch, change color, or become raised, then of course come back. But I assure you, it's nothing to be concerned about. Elara nodded, pulling her shirt back down. She thanked Dr. Aris, but as she left the office, a knot of dissatisfaction tightened in her stomach. A unique birthmark? She had never felt less convinced. The doctor's words were meant to be comforting, but to Elara, they felt like a dismissal, a convenient label slapped onto something truly inexplicable. The line wasn't raised, it didn't itch, it hadn't changed color. It simply was. And that, paradoxically, was what truly terrified her. The rational part of her brain tried to accept the doctor's explanation. It was a dermal line, a benign anomaly. Millions of people had unusual skin markings. This was just hers. She tried to forget about it, to let it fade into the background of her daily life. But the seam, faint as it was, had carved a permanent place in her awareness. She found herself subconsciously aware of it, a ghost limb of sensation, a constant, subtle hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. Then came the nights. The first time, she woke abruptly, startled by something she couldn't quite identify. The room was utterly dark, the silence profound, broken only by the distant, rhythmic clang of the city's late-night machinery. She lay still, her heart thumping against her ribs, straining to hear whatever had pulled her from sleep. Nothing, just the quiet. As she was about to drift back into slumber, a new sensation rippled through her. It was a vibration. Faint, almost imperceptible, yet distinct. It wasn't the rattling of pipes or the hum of the refrigerator. This was different. It felt internal, emanating from within her own body, but specifically from her back, from the seam. It was a gentle, rhythmic thrumming, like the lowest note of a cello played very, very softly, or the distant beat of a tiny, unseen drum. Thump, 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 thump. Elara lay on her side, rigid with a sudden icy dread. She rolled onto her stomach, trying to press the sensation away, but it persisted, a phantom pulse against her sheets. She sat up, her breath catching in her throat, and pressed her hand flat against her lower back, directly over where the seam ended. She could feel it more clearly now, a distinct, subtle vibration pulsing beneath her palm. It wasn't painful, but it was profoundly unsettling. It was alive. She spent the rest of that night wide awake, huddled beneath her blankets, the rhythmic thrumming a constant, terrifying companion. It pulsed, steady and unwavering, for what felt like hours, only fading with the first gray streaks of dawn. By morning it was gone, leaving behind only the memory of its strange rhythm and a profound sense of exhaustion. For a few days, there was nothing. Alara almost convinced herself it had been a dream, a figment of her sleep-deprived imagination. But then, 2 nights later, it returned, and this time, it was stronger. The vibration was no longer just a faint thrum. It was a distinct pulsation, deep within her, centered precisely along the invisible seam. It felt less like a distant drum, and more like something struggling to expand, a slow, methodical stretch from inside. She could feel it against the mattress, a subtle tremor that seemed to emanate from her body and into the bed itself. It was as if something, stitched up inside her, was just now beginning to wake up. Her nights became a torment. The vibration became a regular occurrence, almost nightly. Sometimes it was soft, a gentle hum that made her skin tingle. Other times, it was a more pronounced, insistent throb, raising goosebumps along her arms, despite the warmth of her bed. It was never painful, but the feeling of something stirring within her, something alien and unknown, was a constant, gnawing terror. She started to dread bedtime, finding excuses to stay awake, drinking endless cups of tea, reading until her eyes burned. Anything to postpone the moment she would lie down in the dark and feel the seam awaken. She began to feel constantly tired, her eyes shadowed, her movements sluggish. Her colleagues at work noticed. "Everything all right, Alara? You look a bit pale." She'd offer a weak smile and a vague excuse about restless sleep. How could she explain? "Oh, just the mysterious, vibrating seam in my back. Nothing to worry about." The fear wasn't just about the physical sensation. It was about the unknown. What was it? What was waking up? Her mind, once so grounded in logic and practicality, began to spin with morbid possibilities. Was it a parasite? A forgotten twin? A piece of an alien artifact surgically implanted? The thoughts were outlandish, irrational, yet they clung to her, whispering in the quiet hours when the seam pulsed. She started researching again, more frantically this time. Not just medical sites, but obscure forums, paranormal blogs, ancient folklore. She typed variations of invisible line on back, vibrating spine, body seam into search engines, desperate for a match. She found stories of phantom limbs, unusual birth defects, even urban legends about people being replaced by doppelgangers with subtle differences. Nothing fit. Nothing resonated with the chilling precision of her seam. One evening, unable to sleep, she lay on her stomach, her face buried in her pillow, listening to the familiar thrumming. It felt stronger tonight, a deep resonance that vibrated up her neck and down into her legs. She closed her eyes, trying to focus on the sensation, to understand its nature. As she did, a faint, almost subliminal sound seemed to accompany the vibration. A sound like rustling, like something shifting, barely, within a confined space. It was so soft, she questioned if she was imagining it, a product of her sleep-deprived mind. But then the rustling would sync with the pulse, a whispery shh, accompanying each thump, thump. Her paranoia began to deepen. She found herself checking locks twice, peering out of her blinds before going to bed. The silence of her apartment, once comforting, now felt oppressive, amplifying every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren, every breath she took. She started avoiding social interactions, finding it difficult to maintain conversations when her entire being was focused on the hidden activity within her own body. One particularly disturbing night, the vibration intensified to a point where it felt like a low-frequency hum throughout her entire bed. She sat bolt upright, heart hammering, staring into the oppressive darkness. The rustling sound was clearer now, like dry leaves scuttling across pavement, but it was coming on from inside her. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She felt a profound sense of pressure, as if something was pushing against her ribs from the inside, pressing outwards. It wasn't pain, but an intense, sickening fullness. She stumbled out of bed, fumbling for the light switch. The sudden glare of the bathroom mirror assaulted her eyes. She turned, desperate, pulling up her nightshirt. The seam was still there, as faint and imperceptible as ever. There were no visible changes, no bulging, no distortion. Yet she could feel it, a distinct internal pressure that made her gasp. She pressed her fingers hard against the line, as if she could push whatever was inside back down, quiet it, make it disappear. But the vibration continued, unheeding. Over the following weeks, Alara became a shadow of her former self. She started wearing loose, baggy clothing to avoid any pressure on her back. She ate less, slept even less, and found herself staring blankly at walls for long stretches of time, lost in the terrifying contemplation of her unwelcome tenant. The birthmark explanation from Dr. Aris seemed ludicrous now. This was not benign. This was alive, and it was growing. She started experimenting, foolishly, dangerously. During one night, when the vibration was particularly strong, she took a tiny, sterilized needle and hovered it over the seam. Her hand trembled violently. What if she punctured it? What if she released something, or worse, awakened it further? The thought made her stomach clench. She couldn't bring herself to do it. The sheer, terrifying unknown of what lay beneath that perfect line paralyzed her. The internal rustling grew more defined, sometimes sounding like soft, dragging movements, like something sluggishly adjusting itself within a tight space. Alara began to feel lightheaded during the day, a constant faintness that made her movements feel disconnected from her body. It was as if her own energy was being siphoned, subtly, steadily, by the thing that stirred beneath her skin. She'd catch glimpses of herself in reflective surfaces, noticing the sunken look in her eyes, the drawn pallor of her skin. She was wasting away, a husk, while something else flourished. One afternoon, while trying to prepare a simple meal, she dropped a knife. It clattered loudly on the tiled floor. Her hand had simply opened. She stared at it, bewildered. It wasn't numb, nor did it tingle. It had just decided, for a split second, to release its grip. Later that day, she found herself humming a tune she didn't recognize, a strange, discordant melody that sent a shiver down her spine. These small, uncharacteristic acts began to accumulate, subtle aberrations in her behavior that she couldn't account for. Was the thing inside affecting her nervous system? Was it merely a physical burden? Or was it reaching into her mind, her very will. The seam itself remained unchanged to the naked eye. Yet Ilara swore that in the dimmest light, just before dawn, she could sometimes detect a faint, almost iridescent shimmer along its length, a brief, fleeting gleam that vanished the moment she tried to focus on it. And sometimes, when the vibration was at its peak, she imagined she could feel a faint warmth radiating from it, a heat that spoke of slow, internal metabolic activity. She became a hermit, avoiding friends, ignoring calls. The few times she ventured out, the rhythmic thrumming in her back seemed to intensify in crowded places, as if the thing inside was reacting to the proximity of others, to the sensory overload of the outside world. It made her feel exposed, vulnerable, as though her terrifying secret was pulsing visibly for all to see. Her dreams, once a comforting escape, became vivid, grotesque extensions of her waking terror. She dreamt of dark, viscous fluid, of being stretched and pulled from the inside, of tiny, chitinous legs scuttling beneath her skin. She would wake, screaming, bathed in sweat, the internal vibration in her back a cruel reminder that the nightmare was not confined to sleep. One night, the vibration began earlier than usual, just as the sun set. It built rapidly, not with its usual slow rhythm, but with an escalating, frantic tremor. The rustling sound grew louder, distinctly audible now, a frantic squirming sensation that made her whole body tense. It was no longer a passive awakening. It was an urgent struggle. Ilara gasped, pressing her hands against her back, her fingers tracing the path of the seam. She could feel a distinct, almost palpable pressure against her inner skin, something hard and curved, pressing upwards, desperately. It felt like a small, tightly coiled spring, pushing against the delicate boundary of her flesh. A faint, almost imperceptible bulging, a mere shadow of a curve, appeared briefly along the seam line, then receded. A new sensation emerged, terrifyingly visceral. A faint, metallic taste bloomed in her mouth, accompanied by a phantom scent of something ancient and dusty, like disturbed earth. Her teeth began to chatter, not from cold, but from an uncontrollable tremor that ran through her jaw. She stumbled to the bathroom again, her legs weak, and pulled off her shirt. In the harsh glare of the fluorescent light, the seam looked the same, but the sensation radiating from it was overwhelming. It was struggling, trying to break free, or perhaps to expand. She whimpered, a small, choked sound, her eyes wide with terror. Then, from deep within her, a new sound, distinct from the rustling and the vibration, reached her ears. It was a faint click, a soft, almost infinitesimal snap, as if a thread, incredibly thin and taut, had just given way. And with that click, the rhythmic vibration seemed to change. It didn't stop, but it shifted, becoming smoother, more continuous, less like a pulse, and more like a steady, deep hum. The rustling receded, replaced by a profound, pervasive internal stillness. The pressure against her ribs eased. Ilara stood frozen, staring at her back in the mirror, breath held. The seam remained a faint, straight line, but the stillness within her was more terrifying than the struggle. It felt settled, as if the thing inside, whatever it was, had achieved some crucial stage in its awakening. It wasn't fighting anymore. It was simply there, fully awake. And it was waiting. She never went back to Dr. Aris. What could she say? The seam was still there, but now the rhythm was gone, replaced by an unnerving quietness. Yet the quiet was deceptive. She could feel it, always. A deep, pervasive presence, now fully aware within her. Sometimes, late at night, in the profound silence of her room, she would feel a subtle shift, a barely there internal adjustment, like a sleeping creature turning in its sleep. But it was no longer sleeping. It was awake, and it was inside her. And she knew, with chilling certainty, that it was listening, always listening. Fourth story, the static from an unplugged radio. The rain had been falling for 2 days straight when Arthur stumbled upon it. A small, local flea market tucked away beneath the sagging eaves of an old, abandoned mill. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a distraction from the relentless drumming of water against his window panes and the quiet hum of his solitary life. Then he saw it. Perched precariously on a wobbly card table, amidst a jumble of tarnished silverware and chipped porcelain dolls, stood an antique cathedral radio. Its cabinet, crafted from dark, lacquered wood, was a marvel of intricate Art Deco design, the kind of piece that whispered stories of bygone eras. A delicate, amber-colored dial, adorned with faded script for long-gone stations, seemed to glow even in the dim light of the market stall. The speaker grill, a lattice of finely woven fabric, hinted at a rich, resonant sound, now lost to time. It was beautiful, undeniably so, a relic from an age when technology was still imbued with an almost mystical charm. Arthur picked it up, noting its surprising heft. The seller, a gaunt woman with eyes that seemed to have seen too many things, offered it with a non-committal shrug. "Decorative piece," she rasped, her voice as dusty as the radio's surface. "Cords frayed, tubes long dead. No good for listening." Arthur nodded, already captivated. He didn't need it to work. He wasn't a collector, nor was he particularly nostalgic for vintage electronics. But the radio, with its silent grandeur, felt like it belonged somewhere quiet, somewhere respectful. It felt like it belonged with him. He haggled briefly, more out of habit than conviction, and soon the radio was nestled in the passenger seat of his car, radiating a faint scent of old wood and forgotten dust. Back in his apartment, a small, meticulously neat space that often felt more like a hotel room than a home, Arthur found the perfect spot for it: his bedroom. On the low, polished dresser, next to a stack of untouched novels and a simple desk lamp, the cathedral radio stood guard. It was an anchor, a piece of solid historical beauty in a room that sometimes felt too ephemeral, too much like a temporary stop. He admired its lines, tracing the smooth curves of its wooden casing, feeling the faint chill of the brass knobs beneath his fingers. He tucked the frayed, tattered power cord neatly behind it, a defunct umbilical cord to a world it no longer belonged to. He went to bed that night, feeling a rare sense of contentment. The rhythmic patter of the rain, now a soothing lullaby against his window. The first hint came subtly, almost imperceptibly, swallowed by the profound silence of a house asleep. It was the third night after the radio's arrival. Arthur was a light sleeper, accustomed to the faintest creaks of old pipes or the distant hum of the city. But this was different. He stirred, his mind still muddled with the remnants of a dream, and a sound pricked at the edges of his consciousness. A faint, almost subliminal hiss, like air escaping a tire or the whisper of fine sand. He shifted, trying to locate its source. His eyes, still adjusting to the deep gloom of the room, scanned the familiar shapes: the dresser, the radio. And then, with a jolt that cleared the last vestiges of sleep from his mind, he realized the sound was coming from the radio, not just near it, but from it. A low, persistent static. Impossible. Utterly, completely impossible. The cord was unplugged. He knew it was. He had tucked it away himself. He had seen the dead tubes, felt the inert coldness of the mechanism. This was a decorative piece, a wooden box. He sat bolt upright, his heart thrumming a panicked rhythm against his ribs. The static continued, a thin, wavering thread of sound. He fumbled for his phone, its screen a sudden, blinding rectangle of light in the darkness. He shone its beam onto the radio. It stood exactly as he had left it, serene and inanimate. The cord was indeed unplugged, lying curled on the dresser behind it, a mute testament to its disconnection. He leaned closer, his ear almost touching the speaker grill. The static was undeniable, a soft, continuous shush, like a distant ocean wave receding, or the sound of pure, unadulterated emptiness. He spent the rest of that night staring at the radio, sleep an unwelcome stranger. His mind raced, scrambling for logical explanations. Faulty wiring in the house, some strange electromagnetic interference, a trick of the acoustics, perhaps, playing on his tired mind? By dawn, as the first gray light seeped through the blinds, the static seemed to fade, becoming so faint he could no longer be sure if he was still hearing it or merely imagining it. He dismissed it, finally, as a product of exhaustion and an overactive imagination. A quirky, unsettling anomaly. He was, after all, alone in the apartment, and prone to the occasional auditory hallucination when truly deprived of sleep. Yes, that must be it. The next night, the static was back, and it was slightly louder. Not much, just enough to confirm it wasn't a figment of his weary brain. It began around 2 in the morning, a gradual crescendo from silence, building to a low, insistent hum that filled the room. He felt it in his teeth, a subtle vibration that resonated with an unnerving familiarity. This time, he didn't even bother checking the cord. He knew it was unplugged. He knew it was impossible. And yet, there it was. He got out of bed, careful not to make a sound, as if the radio might sense his presence and fall silent. He approached it cautiously, extending a hand, then recoiling just before touching it. It wasn't warm, wasn't vibrating to the touch. It was simply emitting a sound that had no right to exist. He tried covering it with a blanket, a thick wool throw he used on cold nights. The static muffled, but didn't disappear. It seemed to seep through the fabric, a persistent, whispering presence. He ripped the blanket off. This was absurd. He was being ridiculous. It was a radio, a broken one. But beneath the growing tide of his apprehension, a cold, crystalline fear was beginning to form. He tried to think of anything else, to focus on the mundane, to anchor himself in reality. He thought about his unfinished work project, the stack of bills on his kitchen counter, the awkward conversation he'd had with his sister that afternoon. He tried to mentally retrace his day, step by step, a ritual he often used to calm his thoughts. And then it happened. Faintly, almost imperceptibly at first, within the ceaseless shush of the static, a new sound began to coalesce. A whisper. Not a distinct word, not a recognizable syllable, but an impression of sound. As if someone or something were trying to form a breath, a fleeting echo. He strained to hear, leaning in, his breath held. And then, clearer this time, an intonation, a cadence, a rhythm that was disturbingly familiar. It was his own. He flinched back, stumbling against the dresser. The voice was so faint, so interwoven with the static, that he almost convinced himself it was merely auditory pareidolia, his brain trying to make sense of random noise. But then he remembered. Just moments before, as he had mentally reviewed his day, he had thought, I really should have called her back. It was rude of me. And now, within the static, he distinctly heard, in a voice that was undeniably his own inner voice, a fleeting, ghost-like echo, should have called. Rude. He gasped, a dry, choked sound. His skin prickled with 1,000 tiny needles of ice. He wasn't speaking words, not yet. But it was there. His thoughts, his private, unspoken thoughts, whispered back to him from the silent, unplugged mouth of the antique radio. The nights that followed blurred into a continuous nightmare of escalating terror. Each evening, as dusk bled into the deep indigo of night, the radio's low hum would begin, a prelude to the horror. And each night, the static grew demonstrably louder, more insistent, more omnipresent. It was no longer a faint hiss. It was a low, guttural roar that vibrated through the floorboards, a tangible presence in the room. And within it, the voice, his voice. It was no longer just mimicking fragments. Now, it was echoing entire sentences, entire internal monologues, delivered with a chilling accuracy that defied belief. He would think, I hope I locked the front door. And a moment later, from the static, a spectral replica of his own voice would murmur, locked, front door. His thoughts, private and fleeting, were being broadcast, transmuted into sound. It was like living in a hall of mirrors, but the reflections weren't visual. They were auditory, echoing the deepest, most concealed parts of himself. The accuracy grew. The voice within the static wasn't just repeating, it was perfecting. It mirrored not only the words, but the exact intonation, the subtle emphasis, the precise speed with which his thoughts flitted through his mind. If he thought with a hurried urgency, the voice would capture that haste. If his thoughts were slow and melancholic, the radio would reflect that same sorrowful pace. It was like listening to a recording of his own consciousness, played back to him by an unseen, malevolent entity. He tried everything. He moved the radio from his bedroom to the living room, then to a spare closet, then finally, in a fit of desperate rage, shoved it into the deepest corner of his apartment, a dark, disused storage space beneath the stairs. It didn't matter. The static, albeit muffled, still permeated the apartment, a low, thrumming current in the very air. And if he strained, if he truly listened, he could still hear the ghost of his own voice, whispering from the unreachable depths of the storage space. The radio, it seemed, was less a physical object and more a conduit, a portal to a dimension where his inner thoughts were not his own. The lack of sleep began to take its toll. Arthur's eyes were perpetually shadowed, his skin pale and clammy. He became withdrawn, afraid to even think, lest his thoughts be seized and repurposed by the insidious presence emanating from the radio. He stopped talking to himself, even in the privacy of his own mind, a habit he hadn't even realized he possessed until its violation became his greatest fear. He ate little, worked less, and spent most of his days in a state of suspended anxiety, waiting for nightfall, waiting for the static to begin. And then came the judgment. It started subtly, an almost imperceptible shift in the tone of the echoed thoughts. He would think, I really should have taken that promotion. It was a foolish decision to decline. And from the static, his own voice would return, but with a subtle inflection of scorn, a faint, almost imperceptible sneer in the delivery of the words, foolish, decision, decline. The words were his, but the judgment was not. Or was it? Was the radio merely amplifying his own repressed self-criticism, giving it a voice, a tangible form? As the nights bled into weeks, the voice grew clearer, more articulate, and unequivocally more judgmental. It stopped being a mere echo. It became a commentary. He'd think, I feel so lonely sometimes. It's hard to connect with people. And the radio would respond, with his voice, but infused with a mocking, almost cruel detachment. Lonely. Always lonely. Because you push them away. It didn't just repeat his thoughts. It twisted them, exposing his insecurities, his regrets, his failures, and delivering them back to him with a biting, accusatory edge. Did I really do enough for my mother before she passed? He'd think, a wave of guilt washing over him. And from the radio, the static would crackle, and his own voice, imbued with a chilling certainty, would whisper back, no, never enough. You were selfish. Always. He tried to fight it, to silence the relentless critique. He started trying to think only positive thoughts, to fill his mind with affirmations, with light, with hope. It was a futile effort. The radio seemed to penetrate beneath the surface of his conscious mind, reaching for the raw, unvarnished thoughts that lurked beneath. It would seize his attempts at positivity and twist them into their darkest interpretations. He'd think, I'm going to try to be more organized tomorrow. And the radio would scoff, his own voice heavy with disdain, a futile gesture. You always fail. You are inherently chaotic, weak. The voice became a constant companion, a relentless shadow. It knew his deepest fears, his most shameful secrets, the tiny, fleeting impulses he barely acknowledged himself. It knew his petty jealousies, his unkind judgments of others, his secret desires, and it weaponized them all, broadcasting them back to him, amplified and distorted. He found himself avoiding mirrors, fearing that his reflection would show the corruption the voice now imposed upon his very being. He started to believe the judgments, to internalize the accusations. He was selfish. He was weak. He was a failure. The voice from the Unplugged Radio was simply articulating the truth he had always instinctively known, but never dared to voice. One evening, consumed by a desperate, soul-crushing despair, Arthur dragged the radio out from its hiding place. Its dark wood gleamed ominously in the dim light of his living room. The static was already a low thrum, waiting. He considered smashing it, tearing it apart with his bare hands, but a deeper, more primal fear held him back. What if destroying it only made it worse? What if the voice, once confined to the radio, escaped, becoming a presence in every corner of his apartment, in every fiber of his being? He stared at it, his reflection a pale, gaunt parody of himself in the polished surface. I can't live like this, he thought, his mind a raw, exposed nerve. The static intensified, swirling around him, a tangible, suffocating presence. And then, his own voice, clearer than ever before, filled the room, not from the speaker, but from everywhere, from the walls, from the floor, from inside his own skull. Oh, but you can, it purred, the sound a grotesque parody of comfort. You always have. This is who you truly are. I am simply giving voice to the silence you've always carried within you, your own judgment, your own truth. Arthur stumbled backward, falling to the floor, his hands clapped over his ears, though he knew it was useless. The voice was no longer coming from the radio. It was coming from him. Or rather, it had always been within him, waiting for a conduit, waiting for a voice. The radio was simply the key, unlocking the judgment he had always held for himself, now externalized, inescapable, and perfectly articulate. He curled into a ball, tears streaming down his face as the static roared around him, a chorus of his own damning thoughts, perfectly mirrored, perfectly clear, and perfectly judgmental. And through it all, his own voice, echoing infinitely, whispered, "You are not alone now. We are one, and we will never be silent again." Fifth story, the lawns of Echo Ridge. The move to Echo Ridge had at first glance seemed like a dream plucked from the glossy pages of a lifestyle magazine. For the Millers Thomas, Sarah, and their two children, 10-year-old Lily and 8-year-old Sam, it represented a fresh start, an escape from the city's ceaseless grind and the petty anxieties of their previous life. Echo Ridge was everything the brochure had promised, and more. Located just beyond the gentle swell of pine-covered hills, it was a tapestry of perfectly manicured cul-de-sacs, each house a testament to architectural harmony and tasteful landscaping. Every window gleamed, every mailbox stood at a precise, uniformed angle, and every single lawn was, without exception, a flawless, vibrant sheet of emerald green. "It's like living inside a postcard," Sarah had murmured, her voice laced with an awe that bordered on disbelief as they drove down Elmwood Lane for the first time. The air itself seemed cleaner, softer, carrying only the faint, pleasant scent of freshly cut grass and blooming hydrangeas. Thomas, usually cynical, found himself smiling. The children, initially apprehensive about leaving their old friends, were captivated by the sight of other kids cycling on the wide, pristine sidewalks, their laughter sounding like chimes in the clear afternoon. Their new house, number 17, was a charming two-story colonial with a welcoming porch and, naturally, its own expanse of that impossibly perfect lawn. On moving day, neighbors emerged from their immaculate homes, offering bottles of chilled water, plates of homemade cookies, and warm, almost incandescent smiles. Mrs. Henderson from number 19, a woman with perfectly coiffed silver hair, brought over a casserole. Mr. Davies from number 15, a man whose polo shirt seemed crisper than any Thomas had ever owned, helped direct the moving truck. "Welcome to Echo Ridge," they chorused, their voices a synchronized melody of friendliness. "You'll love it here. It's a wonderful place to raise a family." And for the first few weeks, it truly seemed to be. The sun always shone, or at least, it felt that way. The children quickly made friends, disappearing into bicycle brigades that pedaled silently along the spotless streets. Thomas found the commute to his new job surprisingly pleasant, and Sarah, reveling in the quiet calm, began tending to her small flower beds with a newfound sense of peace. The only thing they hadn't quite anticipated was the absolute, almost fanatical devotion of the residents to their lawns. It began subtly, an observation that barely registered as oddity. One afternoon, Lily's soccer ball rolled off their lawn and onto Mr. Davies's. Before she could step onto his impeccable turf to retrieve it, Mr. Davies was there, moving with an astonishing, almost preternatural speed. He scooped up the ball with a gloved hand, his smile unwavering, and handed it back to a slightly bewildered Lily. "Oh, darling," "We don't step on the grass here," he said, his tone utterly devoid of malice, yet with an underlying note of firm instruction that was impossible to misunderstand. "Keeps it perfect, you see?" Lily nodded, a little confused, but accepted the ball. Thomas and Sarah overheard it and chuckled. "Strict lawn code, huh?" Thomas remarked to Sarah later that day. "Guess they take their curb appeal seriously." But as the days bled into weeks, other, more unsettling patterns began to emerge. They noticed that no one, not once, ever walked on the grass. Not the children playing, not the adults fetching a dropped item, not even the mailman. Sidewalks, paved driveways, or meticulously laid stone paths were the only accepted routes of passage. It was as if the emerald carpets were not meant for human touch, preserved for some unseen, inexplicable purpose. Then there was the blinking. Sarah was the first to notice it during a neighborhood barbecue at the community park. As she chatted with a group of women, she observed Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Peterson from number 21, and Mrs. Chan from number 11. They were all smiling, their faces animated, but every few seconds, as if on an invisible cue, their eyelids would lower and rise again, in perfect, chilling unison. It was a fleeting moment, easily dismissed as a trick of the light or Sarah's imagination. But once seen, it could not be unseen. She started watching for it, subtly, and realized it wasn't just the women. The men did it too. Even some of the older children seemed to exhibit this unnerving synchronization. It was never prolonged, just a swift, collective flutter, like a flock of birds taking flight in perfect harmony. The lawnmowers were perhaps the most persistent, pervasive source of their growing unease. Every Saturday morning, without fail, a low, steady hum would begin to emanate from various points across Echo Ridge. Not the roaring, sputtering machines Thomas was used to, but a strangely muted, almost gentle whir. The men would be out, pushing silent, gleaming mowers over their flawless lawns, their expressions serene, almost meditative. The peculiar part was the timing. It wasn't just Saturday mornings. Sometimes a distant hum would start up at 1 a.m. or 3 a.m. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered one particularly stormy Tuesday night, jolting Thomas awake. Rain lashed against their windows. Thunder grumbled in the distance. And yet, distinctly, unmistakably, came the soft, rhythmic whir of a lawnmower. Thomas groaned, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Probably just the wind, hun, or a dream. But it wasn't. They both lay there, listening to the impossible sound, until it faded into the background of the storm. The next morning, the lawns were as immaculate as ever. Not a blade out of place, not a patch of mud or divot from the rain. It was as if the storm had simply parted for the mowers to pass. Sam, with the unfiltered honesty of a child, eventually voiced their unspoken dread. "Dad," he asked one evening, his eyes wide, "why do the neighbors all look the same when they smile? And why do they blink at the same time?" Thomas and Sarah exchanged a glance. It was a question they had both been too afraid to articulate. "They don't, buddy," Thomas said, perhaps too quickly. "It's just a friendly community." But the seed of doubt had been firmly planted. Sarah began spending her afternoons observing. She saw Mrs. Henderson wave goodbye to her husband as he left for work, a practiced, almost mechanical arc of her arm, her smile fixed until his car was out of sight. She watched a group of children playing hopscotch, their movements precise, their laughter bright, but somehow hollow, never truly spontaneous. One sweltering afternoon, a large, iridescent beetle landed on their own perfect lawn. Thomas, who had been watering his newly planted shrubs, reached down to shoo it away. Before his fingers could even brush the grass, Mrs. Davies from next door appeared at her window, her face expressionless for a split second before the familiar, radiant smile clicked back into place. She simply watched him. Thomas, feeling an odd prickle on his neck, quickly withdrew his hand, and the beetle flew off. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had almost crossed an invisible line, violated an unspoken law. The perfection of Echo Ridge was no longer comforting. It was suffocating. It felt less like a community and more like a stage where everyone played their part with unsettling precision. "I think," Sarah said one night, her voice barely a whisper, "they're not just friendly. They're too friendly and too perfect." Thomas knew what she meant. Their smiles never faltered, never shifted into a frown of concern or a grimace of frustration. Their expressions were always pleasant, their interactions always genial. But beneath the veneer, there was an absence, a lack of the genuine, messy humanity that makes a person real. It was like looking at exquisite porcelain dolls, beautiful but lifeless. The children, too, began to withdraw. Lily stopped riding her bike with the neighborhood kids, claiming they only wanted to play games with overly strict rules, and that their laughter sounded funny. Sam started having nightmares, muttering about whispering grass and eyes that never close. One day, Thomas decided he had had enough of the insidious whispers and the unspoken anxieties. He would investigate. He started with the lawns. He examined their own patch of green closely. The blades were uniform, of an unnatural length, and seemed to possess an almost luminous sheen. He tried to pull a blade, but it resisted, feeling surprisingly tough, almost fibrous, like synthetic material, yet undeniably alive. He walked to the edge of their property line and peered at Mrs. Henderson's lawn. It was identical. He saw no signs of irrigation systems, no sprinklers. How were they maintained with such flawless consistency, especially after a storm, especially in the dead of night? That night, he set his alarm for 2:45 a.m. When it rang, he crept out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah. The house was silent, save for the gentle hum of the refrigerator. He tiptoed to the living room window and peered out. The moon was full, casting a stark silver light over the manicured landscape. And there it was. Not a human figure, not a person pushing a mower, but a small, silent, gleaming contraption, no bigger than a large tortoise, gliding effortlessly across the Hendersons' lawn. Its blades, if they were blades, were invisible, simply leaving a trail of absolute, undiminished perfection in its wake. There were dozens of them, he realized, small, automated units, moving with silent purpose across every lawn in Echo Ridge. Some were moving in tandem, others crisscrossing, but all were working with the same uncanny efficiency. The sound he and Sarah had heard was not that of a traditional mower, but the soft, almost imperceptible whir of these machines. He watched, mesmerized and horrified, as one of the robotic devices approached the edge of the lawn, stopped precisely, pivoted, and began its next pass. It was a ballet of silent, programmed efficiency. But then, something else caught his eye. As one of the devices passed over a particular spot on Mrs. Peterson's lawn, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer rose from the grass, like heat haze. It was gone in an instant. He strained his eyes, watching for it, and saw it again and again, always in the same fleeting way. It was as if the grass itself was reacting, pulsating almost, to the touch of the machines. He returned to bed, his mind racing. The lawns weren't just cared for. They were maintained by something non-human, and the grass itself seemed to possess a strange, reactive quality. The next day, he confided in Sarah. She listened, her face paling. "Robots," she whispered. "But why the secrecy? And why do the neighbors act the way they do?" "That's what I intend to find out," Thomas said, a grim determination in his voice. He decided to pay closer attention to the neighbors. He started leaving his front door slightly ajar, listening to their morning routines. He noticed they rarely spoke to each other beyond pleasantries, and their interactions, even within families, seemed strangely formal, lacking the spontaneous affection he was used to. One afternoon, he saw Mrs. Henderson drop a grocery bag, spilling a single orange onto her lawn. She froze, her smile momentarily gone, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. She stared at the orange as if it were a venomous snake, then quickly, almost frantically, kicked it back onto the paved driveway with her foot, never allowing her shoe to touch the grass. The orange rolled. She scooped it up, and her smile snapped back into place as if nothing had happened. But Thomas had seen the flicker of raw fear in her eyes. It wasn't about keeping the lawn pristine. It was about avoiding contact. He started experimenting, small, controlled tests. He accidentally dropped a small coin onto their own lawn. He watched from the window. Minutes passed. Then one of the silent, tortoise-like machines appeared from under their porch, glided over to the coin, nudged it off the grass, and then retreated. The perfection wasn't just obsessive. It was a cover. A cover for what? Thomas remembered Sam's nightmare about whispering grass. He dismissed it as a child's imagination. But then, an even stranger incident occurred. He was outside, tending to a stubborn rosebush near the edge of their lawn. As he knelt, he heard it. A faint, almost subliminal hum coming from the grass itself. A sound that vibrated more in his bones than in his ears. It was a low, resonant frequency, just beneath the threshold of conscious hearing, and it seemed to intensify when he was closer to the green. He placed his hand flat on the grass. The hum intensified, and he felt a faint, pulsating warmth beneath his palm. It was unnerving, like touching something alive, something vast and ancient that was barely contained beneath the manicured surface. He pulled his hand away quickly, a shiver running down his spine. The grass of Echo Ridge was not just grass. It was something else. He began researching the history of Echo Ridge, old maps, property records, anything he could find online or at the town library in the neighboring, less than perfect community. Echo Ridge had only existed for 20 years. Before that, the land was simply an untouched, sprawling meadow. The original development company had been a shadowy entity, dissolved shortly after the last house was sold. There was no clear record of the landscape architects or the specific contractors who had laid the foundations for this meticulously perfect world. One evening, unable to sleep, Thomas was pacing their living room. He glanced out the window towards the Davies house. The lights were on in their kitchen, and through the sheer curtains, he could see Mr. Davies standing by the sink. And then, he saw it. Mr. Davies turned, and his head seemed to rotate just a fraction too far. snapping back into place with a subtle, mechanical whir that Thomas almost imagined. His movements were fluid, yes, but almost too fluid, too precise, too lacking in the small human awkwardness that defines real people. The synchronized blinking, the fixed smiles, the mechanical lawn mowers, the grass that nobody dared to touch, that hummed with a low, unnatural frequency. It clicked into place, a horrific mosaic forming in his mind. The people of Echo Ridge were not people, not truly, or, if they once were, they were no longer. He tried to talk to Sarah more directly, but she seemed increasingly distant, her own smile becoming subtly more fixed, more like the others. She dismissed his theories, gently but firmly. "You're just stressed, Thomas. It's a new place. Give it time." Her eyes, though, seemed to hold a flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher, a knowing emptiness. One rainy afternoon, the kind of torrential downpour that usually turned lawns into muddy puddles, Thomas watched as the storm raged outside. Thunder cracked, lightning illuminated the sky in stark flashes, and from the window, he saw them. The silent, tortoise-like machines were still out, gliding across the lawns, undeterred by the deluge. But this time, they weren't alone. Beneath the steady, rhythmic whir of the silent mowers, the grass itself seemed to shimmer with that faint, heat haze effect he had noticed before, only more pronounced now. It pulsed, a low, vibrant green. And then he saw shapes begin to form within the emerald expanse. Not clear figures, but vague, indistinct outlines, as if something was pressing against the underside of the turf, trying to push through. They were like indistinct forms, flowing beneath the surface, following the path of the silently whirring machines. The perfection wasn't just obsessive. It was a cover for something deeply, fundamentally artificial and wrong. The lawns were not merely grass. They were a living, pulsating membrane. And the people of Echo Ridge, they were its guardians, its extensions, or perhaps its unwitting prisoners. Their perfect smiles, their synchronized blinks, their unwavering friendliness, all were part of the facade, a programmed response designed to maintain the serene illusion. The true horror wasn't in a monster lurking in the shadows, but in the insidious realization that the world they had moved into, this idyllic suburban paradise, was a meticulously crafted lie. The perfection was the trap, the flawless green a snare, and the quiet hum beneath the surface was the sound of the true residents of Echo Ridge, silently, endlessly, ensuring their perfect, unchanging world. Thomas looked at Sarah, sitting on the couch, reading a magazine, a serene, placid smile on her face. He reached out to touch her hand. Her skin felt cool, almost too smooth. And then, in a moment of chilling clarity, he noticed it. Her eyelids fluttered, just once, in perfect, eerie unison, with an unseen rhythm, a rhythm that was pulsing, ever so faintly, from the emerald lawns outside their window. And he knew, with a certainty that froze his blood, that the Millers had not moved into Echo Ridge. They had been absorbed by it, and the hum from the lawns, the silent whir of the machines, continued its endless, perfect work, just beneath the surface. Sixth story, the collection of smiles. The dust motes danced in the solitary beam of sunlight that pierced the grimy window of Arthur's inherited studio apartment. It was a space, much like the life he was slowly trying to build, that felt perpetually on the verge of becoming something, but never quite arriving. Arthur, a budding photographer, more adept at capturing candid moments of urban decay than grand artistic statements, had always found beauty in the forgotten, the overlooked. So, when the solicitor informed him of a distant great-aunt's passing and the unexpected bequest of a single, unassuming wooden box, his curiosity was immediately piqued. He'd expected antique lace, perhaps some moth-eaten heirlooms, certainly not this. The box was heavy, about the size of an old shoebox, its surface smooth with age and a fine layer of settled dust. There was no lock, no inscription, just the faint scent of something old and strangely sterile, like a hospital corridor, long after the patient has gone. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed tissue paper, were dozens of glass plate negatives. They clinked softly as he lifted the top one, holding it to the light. It was an image, ghostly and reversed, of a woman's face. Arthur had always been fascinated by the photographic process of yesteryear. He admired the patience, the precision, the tangible nature of a physical negative. He owned an old large-format camera, a beautiful brass-lensed contraption he rarely used, preferring the immediacy of his digital SLR. But these were different. They called to him with a silent, sepia-toned promise. He spent the next few days preparing his small, makeshift dark room, the cramped bathroom, sealed with blankets and blackout curtains. The familiar smell of fixer and developer began to permeate the air, a chemical perfume that always brought a strange sense of peace. He handled the glass plates with reverence, sliding one carefully into the developing tray. The first image emerged slowly, a pale phantom coalescing from the milky emulsion. It was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with kind eyes and a neatly trimmed mustache. Arthur smiled faintly. A pleasant start. He moved to the next, then the next, a rhythm forming in the silent, red-lit room. Women in high-collared dresses, children with solemn gazes, young men with severe partings in their hair. All from the early 1900s, judging by the attire and hairstyles. They were anonymous faces, frozen snippets of lives lived a century ago, and Arthur felt a strange connection to them, a sense of acting as their silent custodian. Then came the fourth plate. As it slowly came into focus in the developer, Arthur felt a prickle of unease. It was a woman, perhaps in her 20s, with soft, wavy hair pulled back from her face. But her mouth was wrong. It was stretched unnaturally wide, pulling her lips taut over her gums, revealing a startlingly uniform row of teeth. It was a smile, undeniably, but one devoid of any warmth, any mirth. It was rigid, almost painful, like a mask hastily pulled over a scream. He dismissed it as an anomaly, perhaps a trick of the light, or a subject uncomfortable with the long exposure times. He developed the fifth plate, another woman, older this time, her eyes crinkling at the corners in what might have been genuine amusement. But her mouth, the same wide, unfeeling grin. Too many teeth, too much tension in the cheeks. A cold knot formed in Arthur's stomach. He carefully processed the sixth, then the seventh, his fingers trembling slightly as each new face appeared in the developing fluid. A young boy, no older than 10, his eyes wide and innocent, but his mouth contorted into that same bizarre, terrifying rictus. An elderly couple, seated formally, their hands clasped, their bodies stiff with old age. But their mouths were identical, stretched into that impossible, unnatural smile. He pulled the remaining plates from the box, laying them out on a clean towel beneath the dim red safety light. There were over 50 of them, perhaps 60, and as he quickly scanned their ghostly impressions, he knew. He knew with a certainty that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. Every single one, without exception, bore that same horrifying, frozen smile. Arthur emerged from the dark room hours later, the stack of dried prints clutched in his hand. The fluorescent light of the kitchen felt too bright, too stark. He laid the photographs out on the table, spreading them across the worn laminate surface like a macabre deck of cards. Old men, young women, babies, families, all strangers, all staring back at him with that same unnervingly wide, utterly joyless expression. It was the smile of a puppet, a grotesque caricature of human emotion. There was no variation in its width, no difference in the number of teeth exposed, no hint of genuine feeling behind the stretched lips. It was a mold applied indiscriminately to every face. His initial revulsion gave way to a consuming obsession. Who were these people? How had they all come to bear this identical, unsettling mark? And why had his distant relative kept such a collection, carefully preserving these disturbing mementos from another era? He scoured the back of the plates, the tissue paper, the box itself, for any clue, any name, any date. Nothing. They were utterly anonymous. He spent days in libraries, poring over local historical archives, old newspapers, any documentation that might shed light on a turn-of-the-century photographer or a strange cultural phenomenon involving such smiles. He looked for missing persons reports, for strange medical conditions that might cause such facial rigidity, for forgotten sects or cults with unusual practices. He found nothing. The internet, usually a vast ocean of information, offered no solace. Every search for unnatural smiles 1900s or creepy old portraits yielded only the expected. And none of this. The more he studied the photographs, the more they seemed to exert a peculiar pull on him. He propped them up around his apartment, on the mantelpiece, leaning against books on his shelves, even on his bedside table. He would wake in the middle of the night and find himself staring at a particular portrait, the wide smile seeming to expand and contract in the dim light, the eyes of the subject following him. He began to notice subtle changes in himself. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. He'd catch his reflection in a window or a mirror, and for a fleeting second, his own mouth would seem to be pulled wider than usual, the corners straining towards his ears. He'd quickly correct it, blaming fatigue, or a trick of the light, or perhaps the psychological effect of staring at so many distorted faces. But the occurrences grew more frequent. He'd be deep in thought, perhaps walking down the street, and a sudden stiffness would seize his jaw. He'd feel the muscles in his cheeks tighten, his lips stretch, and a phantom coolness on his gums where too many teeth were exposed. He'd hastily press his lips together, feeling a bizarre, almost painful resistance. It was as if his face was no longer entirely his own, as if some invisible sculptor was slowly, deliberately reshaping his features. His friends started to notice. "You look tired, Arthur," one commented, his brow furrowed. "Are you feeling okay? You've got a strange look about you sometimes." Arthur would force a casual laugh, a normal unstretched smile, but he felt the falseness of it, the effort required to make it appear natural. He grew more isolated, spending almost all his time in the apartment, surrounded by his silent, smiling subjects. He ate less, slept fitfully, haunted by dreams where the faces from the photographs would contort further, their smiles widening until their jaws unhinged, swallowing him whole. He felt their collective gaze on him, a pressure, an expectation. One evening, developing another batch of plates, he'd returned to the box, hoping to find some that were less affected, some that showed normal expressions, but they were all the same. He caught his full reflection in the dark room mirror. The dim red light cast long, shifting shadows, distorting shapes. He was holding a developing tray, staring into it, waiting for an image to appear. And there, reflected back at him, was his own face. It was pale, drawn, his eyes wide with an unnerving intensity, and his mouth was open, not in a scream, not in a yawn, but in that precise, chilling smile. It was wide, revealing a full set of teeth, the corners of his lips pulled high and taut, exactly like the dozens of portraits scattered on his kitchen table. It wasn't a quick, involuntary twitch this time. It was fixed, unwavering. A scream caught in his throat, choked by the rigid muscles of his jaw. He tried to close his mouth, to force his lips together, but they wouldn't obey. The muscles were locked, stretched, held in that terrible, frozen grin. He stared, horrified, at his own reflection, at the monstrous parody of a smile that had taken root on his face. It was as if the very act of studying those disturbing images had imprinted their curse upon him. He was no longer just the photographer. He was becoming one of the subjects, another addition to the collection. Panic seized him. He stumbled out of the dark room, tearing down the blackout curtains, desperate for normal light, for anything to break the spell. But the smile remained, a permanent fixture. He tried to speak, but the words came out garbled, distorted by the forced shape of his mouth. He felt his throat constrict, his breath shallow. He stumbled towards the photographs, sweeping them off the table in a furious, desperate frenzy. Glass plates shattered against the floor, prints scattered like dead leaves. He wanted to destroy them, to erase the very existence of that smile. But even as he did, he felt the corners of his own lips strain further, an invisible hand pulling them tauter, wider. His gums felt exposed, his teeth suddenly alien in his mouth. He sank to the floor amidst the shards of glass and scattered paper, gasping, tears streaming down his face. But his mouth remained locked in that terrifying, joyful grimace. It was the smile of absolute horror, of utter surrender. He was no longer Arthur, the budding photographer. He was merely another subject, captured, collected, and now, finally, transformed. The last thing he remembered was catching his reflection in a piece of broken glass. His eyes, once full of a curious spark, now held a vacant, terrified stare. But the smile was perfect. It was the same smile that adorned every face in the collection, a silent, eternal testament to a forgotten horror. He lay there, paralyzed, his face a grotesque mask, waiting to be developed, waiting to be added to the endless, silent gallery of smiles. 7th story, the star that isn't there. The night was a familiar comfort to Arthur Penhaligon. For years, it had been his sanctuary, a vast, indifferent canvas upon which he projected his quiet anxieties and found solace in their utter insignificance. Arthur was an amateur astronomer, a man who, by day, navigated the complex, often chaotic world of actuarial tables and financial forecasts. But by night, he shed the suit of structured data for the worn velvet of his stargazing chair, his gaze fixed upwards through the polished lens of his telescope. He found a profound, almost spiritual peace in the predictable ballet of the cosmos, in the unwavering adherence of celestial bodies to the immutable laws of physics. The universe was a grand, cosmic clock, and Arthur felt a quiet satisfaction in merely observing its precise, eternal tick-tock. His current fascination was Lyra, a small yet elegant constellation easily identifiable by the brilliant sapphire of Vega. He knew its every star, its every faint nebulae, its every distant galaxy like old friends. He had charted it countless times, each viewing a reaffirmation of the universe's steadfast order. Tonight, a crisp, clear, late autumn night promised exceptional viewing. The air was still, the light pollution from the distant city a mere smudge on the horizon, too far to truly interfere with the pristine dark of his rural observatory. He adjusted the focus, the fainter stars resolving into pinpricks of light, their colors the fiery reds, the cool blues, the muted yellows shimmering in the eyepiece. Then he saw it. It was almost imperceptible at first, a phantom whisper of light at the very edge of his peripheral vision within the eyepiece. He blinked, assuming it was a speck of dust on the lens, or perhaps a persistent floaters in his eye. He shifted slightly, nudged the telescope, even took a moment to clean the eyepiece with a soft cloth. Still there, a tiny, faint point of light, barely brighter than the surrounding cosmic dust, situated just beyond the familiar arc of Lyra's main stars, in a region he knew, with absolute certainty, should be utterly devoid of anything but the black void of interstellar space. His brow furrowed. Arthur was meticulous. His star charts, dog-eared and annotated over years, were more sacred to him than any ledger. He knew the coordinates of every catalogued object in that specific celestial quadrant by heart. This light, this minuscule flicker, was not on any chart. It was not in the extensive databases he cross-referenced online. It was an uninvited guest, an anomaly that dared to disrupt the cosmic harmony he cherished. A prickle of something akin to irritation rather than curiosity began to worm its way into his calm. He spent the next few hours, long past the time he usually retired, trying to dismiss it. He recalibrated his telescope, checked his alignment with Polaris, even dragged out older, less used star atlases from dusty shelves. Nothing. The small, faint point remained, stubbornly defying explanation. It was too distant, too dim to be a satellite or space debris. It had a consistency, a stillness that spoke of something far grander, yet utterly alien to his knowledge. Sleep that night was a restless affair. The faint dot danced behind his eyelids, eclipsing the serene images of nebulae and galaxies he usually conjured. The irritation transmuted into a gnawing obsession. He needed to know. He had to know. The predictable ballet of the cosmos had just introduced a rogue dancer, and Arthur found he could not look away. The following days were consumed by research and frantic budgeting. His current telescope, while respectable, was not powerful enough to resolve such a minute, distant object with any clarity. He needed more aperture, more light-gathering capability. He researched refractors, reflectors, Schmidt-Cassegrains. He devoured reviews, compared specifications, and finally, with a significant portion of his savings, he ordered state-of-the-art 14-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope, complete with advanced go-to capabilities and a high-resolution imaging camera. The anticipation, initially an excited tremor, soon became a desperate itch. The weeks it took for the new equipment to arrive were agonizing. Every clear night, he would set up his old telescope, pointed at the phantom star, and feel a surge of frustration at its stubborn refusal to reveal its nature. His colleagues at work noticed his distraction, the faint shadows under his eyes. He dismissed their concerns with vague mentions of a demanding project, but his mind was constantly drifting, pulled by the invisible string of that unknown point of light. Finally, the crates arrived. The sheer size of the telescope was imposing, its smooth white tube gleaming under the garage lights. Arthur spent the better part of a weekend assembling it, meticulously following every instruction, his hands trembling slightly with a mix of excitement and trepidation. He felt like an archaeologist uncovering an ancient, forbidden artifact. This wasn't just a new piece of equipment. It was a key, a tool that would unlock a secret the universe had, for some reason, chosen to hide. The first clear night after assembly was a revelation. The new telescope, with its impressive light-gathering power, transformed the familiar night sky. Stars that were once barely visible twinkled with newfound brilliance. Distant galaxies resolved into spiraling arms of light. His heart pounded as he slowly, carefully, slewed the telescope towards the coordinates of the anomaly. He attached the camera, intending to capture a long exposure image, but first, he wanted to see it with his own eyes. He lowered his eye to the eyepiece, took a deep breath, and focused. What he saw stole the air from his lungs, chilled his blood, and replaced the tick-tock of the cosmic clock with the frantic, deafening beat of his own terrified heart. It wasn't a new star. It wasn't a faint nebula. It wasn't anything he had ever seen or conceived of. It was a hole. A perfect, impossibly circular pinprick of absolute, utter blackness. It absorbed light, didn't reflect it. It was not merely dark. It was the absence of light, a vacuum of illumination, a void within the void. Around its edges, the surrounding stars shimmered with a faint, almost imperceptible distortion, as if the very fabric of space was tautly stretched around this unholy puncture. It was too precise, too geometric, to be a natural phenomenon, like a black hole or a dark nebula. Black holes devoured light, yes, but they still bent and distorted the light of background stars in a way that revealed their immense gravity. This was different. This was a clean cut, a puncture wound in the tapestry of existence. Arthur stared, his eye unblinking, his breath hitched in his throat. His rational mind, the mind that dealt with numbers and probabilities, screamed for an explanation. But there was none. This was beyond calculus, beyond physics as he knew it. It was an impossibility made manifest. And then, the dread began. Not just the intellectual terror of encountering the unknown, but something far more primal, more insidious. He couldn't explain it, couldn't articulate it, but as he stared into that perfect, circular negation of light, he got the distinct, terrifying impression that something on the other side was looking back through it. It wasn't a visual impression. There were no eyes, no discernible shape, no flicker of movement within the absolute blackness. It was a feeling, a cold, intrusive awareness that seemed to penetrate the very core of his being, bypassing his sight and sound, and settling directly into the deepest, most vulnerable parts of his consciousness. It felt ancient, vast, and utterly indifferent, yet intensely focused on him. The silence of his observatory became oppressive, the gentle hum of the telescope's motor a jarring intrusion. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the protective layers of Earth's atmosphere, of space itself, had suddenly thinned to tissue paper. He tore his eye from the eyepiece, staggering back from the telescope as if struck. His hands trembled, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He stumbled into his armchair, burying his face in his hands, trying to shake off the invasive sensation. But it clung to him, a lingering chill that wasn't from the autumn night. He knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that he had been seen, not just observed, but perceived, singled out from the billions of souls on Earth. He was known. For the rest of the night, he couldn't bring himself to approach the telescope again. It stood there, a silent, accusing sentinel, its polished lens pointing towards the unfathomable. Every shadow in the room seemed to lengthen. Every creak of the old house echoed with a sinister resonance. He tried to rationalize, to convince himself it was a trick of the light, an optical illusion, the fatigue of late night observing playing havoc with his mind. But the feeling, the pervasive, undeniable sensation of being watched, persisted. It wrapped around him like a shroud, suffocating him with its icy grip. The days that followed were a blur of sleeplessness and mounting paranoia. Arthur stopped his nightly observations. The telescope remained covered, a forbidden artifact in his observatory. He couldn't bring himself to even look at the part of the sky where the hole resided. Yet the black circle had burned itself into his retina, his mind. He saw it in the dark corners of his bedroom, glimpsed its perfect edges in the patterns of condensation on his windows, and felt its unseen gaze upon him at all hours. His meticulous routines began to unravel. He made mistakes at work. His concentration shattered. His colleagues' concerned glances grew into open worry. He started to avoid social interactions, preferring the solitary confinement of his house, where at least he felt he could control the immediate environment, but he couldn't control the feeling. It was always there, a pressure behind his eyes, a prickling sensation on his skin. He tried to search for similar phenomena, poring over obscure astronomical texts, fringe theories, and even ancient myths. Nothing matched. There were discussions of wormholes, of singularities, of cosmic strings, but none described a perfect, absolute void that looked back. He considered contacting a professional observatory, sharing his data, but fear paralyzed him. What would they say? They would dismiss him as a crank, a delusional amateur. Or worse, if they believed him, what would happen then? The thought of humanity's reaction to such a discovery, of the panic, the existential dread, was almost as terrifying as the hole itself. He felt a terrible burden, the sole witness to a cosmic secret that could shatter the fragile illusion of human importance. One night, drawn by an irresistible, morbid curiosity, he found himself back in the observatory. The air was heavy, charged with an invisible tension. He uncovered the telescope, its smooth white surface feeling cold and alien beneath his trembling fingers. He didn't turn on the tracking motors. He just nudged it manually, slowly, towards that terrifying patch of sky. He didn't intend to look through the eyepiece. He just wanted to feel its presence. As the large tube swung silently, he stopped it, the faint hum of the distant city lights the only sound. He stared at the spot in the heavens where it should be, an almost invisible puncture in the velvet blackness. The feeling intensified. a crushing weight on his chest. It was closer. Or perhaps the gaze had grown more potent, more direct. He suddenly had the chilling thought that it wasn't a hole in space, but a window through something else entirely. A membrane, a veil, and it was peeling back. The blackness, which had seemed so utterly static and absolute, now seemed to possess a subtle, almost imperceptible pulsation, a faint throb that mirrored the frantic beating of his own heart. Was it growing? Or was his perception changing, warped by fear and sleepless nights? He found himself compelled to reach out, to extend a trembling hand towards the eyepiece, as if to confirm its reality. Just as his fingers brushed the cool metal, a subtle change occurred. The distortion around the edges of the hole in his mind's eye seemed to ripple, like water around a stone dropped into a still pond. And then, for a split second, something shifted within the absolute blackness. It wasn't a form or a shape, but a sensation of movement, of an immense, ancient consciousness stirring. And with that stirring came a wave of pure, unadulterated dread, a profound sense of cosmic insignificance and terrifying vulnerability that threatened to overwhelm his sanity. It was the feeling of being utterly alone, yet simultaneously scrutinized by something so alien, so powerful, that his existence was less than a fleeting thought to it. He stumbled back again, overturning his stargazing chair, its wooden legs scraping loudly on the concrete floor. He backed away, his gaze fixed on the telescope, now a monstrous cyclops pointing its accusatory eye at the abyss. He had seen too much. He had peered into a place not meant for human eyes, and something had peered back. And the chilling part was, he knew, with a certainty that gnawed at his very soul, that it hadn't finished looking. The star that wasn't there was now undeniably and permanently there, and it was watching him. And he knew, with a terrifying finality, that he would never again find peace in the predictable ballet of the cosmos. The music had changed, and he was the unwilling, terrified dancer in a play he could not comprehend. 8th story. The apartment with the gentle ghost. Elara was an artist, a painter of forgotten corners and hushed light, and her latest canvas was the city itself. So, when she stumbled upon the listing for a sprawling, slightly neglected apartment on the 4th floor of an ancient brick building, she saw not decay, but character. The kind of character that promised stories in every creaking floorboard and peeling wallpaper pattern. It was large, affordable, and flooded with the kind of soft, diffused light that made her fingers itch for a brush. She signed the lease with a flourish, feeling the thrill of new beginnings settle in her bones. The apartment was a labyrinth of high ceilings and oddly shaped rooms, with a narrow, echoing hallway that seemed to stretch into perpetual twilight. Her studio, the largest room, faced west, catching the late afternoon sun in a glorious, golden cascade. It smelled faintly of old wood and dust, a scent that she found strangely comforting, like turning the pages of a forgotten book. For the first few days, Elara reveled in the quiet, the sheer space, the sense of being untethered in a vast, inspiring void. She unpacked her paints, her canvases, her countless books, and began to make the place her own. It began subtly, as these things often do. A shirt she swore she'd left crumpled on the bed, later found neatly folded on the chair. A scattered pile of sketches, arranged into a tidy stack. Her coffee mug, rinsed and placed on the drying rack. despite her distinct memory of leaving it by the sink, still encrusted with the remnants of her morning brew. At first, Elara blamed herself. Tiredness, absent-mindedness, the general chaos of moving into a new place. She laughed it off, attributing it to a sudden, inexplicable bout of domesticity, a fleeting desire for order she hadn't known she possessed. But the occurrences became too frequent, too precise, to be her own doing. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of wrestling with a difficult composition, she returned home to find her overflowing laundry basket empty, its contents, mostly a mix of paint-splattered jeans and old t-shirts, folded with meticulous care into perfect rectangles. Each item was smoothed, crisply creased, as if prepared for a grand display. There was a faint, almost imperceptible scent in the air, a delicate whisper of lavender, so soft it felt more like a memory than a fragrance. Elara stood in the doorway, a half-eaten sandwich forgotten in her hand, a shiver running down her spine. This was no ordinary tidiness. A few days later, she woke to find her collection of art history tomes, which she had carelessly piled on the floor beside her bed, now meticulously stacked on the small built-in bookshelf, arranged by size. Her scattered paintbrushes, which she often left soaking in jars of turpentine, were cleaned, dried, and organized neatly in their wooden holder. The lavender scent was stronger that morning, a comforting, almost maternal presence that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. Elara, who had always been a solitary soul, found herself speaking aloud to the empty rooms. "Thank you," she'd murmur, after discovering some new act of quiet helpfulness. "You really didn't have to." A strange warmth bloomed in her chest, a sense of being cared for, watched over by a benevolent, unseen hand. She started leaving notes, whimsical drawings on scraps of paper, sometimes just a single word: lovely. She imagined a kindly old woman, perhaps a former resident, still lingering, still caring for her beloved home. She started calling it, affectionately, my gentle ghost. The gentle ghost became a quiet companion. Elara would wake to freshly brewed coffee, its aroma already filling the kitchen, a thoughtful gesture that never failed to bring a smile to her lips. Her canvases, left leaning against the wall, would sometimes be subtly shifted, just enough to catch the light better. Once, she misplaced her favorite palette knife, searching for it for nearly an hour, only to find it later, resting neatly on her easel, cleaned and shining. The lavender scent was a constant companion now, a warm, floral hug that softened the edges of her solitude. She even started leaving little gifts for her unseen helper. A particularly fragrant bar of soap, a new unused tea towel, a small, polished stone. She felt a profound connection to this quiet presence, a bond that transcended the living and the dead. The apartment felt safer, more welcoming, protected. But then, a subtle shift began to occur. The tidiness, once a comfort, started to feel obsessive. Her clothes weren't just folded. They were pressed flat, every wrinkle smoothed away, as if a perfectionist's hand had hovered over them for hours. Her books were no longer simply stacked by size. They were aligned with an almost unsettling precision. Spines perfectly flush, covers mirroring each other. The lavender scent, once a gentle whisper, became omnipresent, almost suffocating, masking something else that Elara couldn't quite place. A faint, earthy smell, like damp soil or old, undisturbed stone, began to prickle at the edges of her awareness, always fleeting, always just beyond the reach of conscious identification. One afternoon, she was painting in her studio, lost in the intricate dance of light and shadow, when a small, almost imperceptible creak echoed from the wall directly behind her easel. It wasn't the usual settling of an old building, but something softer, more deliberate. She paused, brush held midair, listening. Silence. She shrugged it off, attributing it to her imagination, a side effect of intense focus. But then, a moment later, a faint, scraping sound, like claws dragging lightly across plaster, seemed to ripple from the same wall. Elara spun around, her heart giving a little lurch. Nothing. Just the faded floral wallpaper, still clinging valiantly to its crumbling edges. The next morning, her favorite paint palette, which she had left carelessly on her workbench, was not just clean, but arranged with a precise, almost unnatural symmetry. Her tubes of paint, previously scattered, were lined up in perfect color gradients. But on the smooth wooden surface of the palette, just barely visible in the morning light, was a faint, shallow scratch. It was thin, sharp, almost a score mark, as if something with a hardened edge had been dragged across it. Elara ran her finger over it, a chill prickling her skin. This wasn't the work of her gentle ghost. Her ghost tidied, arranged, nurtured. It didn't mark or mar. The lavender scent that day was overwhelming, almost acrid, as if desperate. It seemed to pulse with an unspoken urgency, filling her lungs with its desperate plea. Elara felt a growing unease, a tightening in her chest. She started to notice small things, a faint, almost invisible trail of dust, like very fine powder, on the floor beneath a gap in the baseboard. A quiet click, deep within the walls, followed by a momentary stillness that felt unnatural, as if the very air had paused to listen. One night, she lay in bed, unable to sleep. The silence of the apartment, once so comforting, now felt oppressive, heavy with unspoken things. She heard a rustle, not from within the room, but from behind the wall of her bedroom closet. It was too soft to be a mouse, too rhythmic to be the wind. It sounded like fabric, rustling fabric. Her gentle ghost, perhaps, still tidying, even in the dead of night. But then, the rustling paused, and a new sound emerged, a soft, almost wet clicking, like something gnawing on bone, or perhaps on old wood. It continued for a long moment, then stopped abruptly, followed by that profound, unnatural silence. Elara pulled the covers tighter, her breath catching in her throat. The lavender scent was now almost painful in its intensity, a desperate scream disguised as a fragrance. She began to observe her apartment with new eyes, a growing sense of dread eclipsing her initial affection. The ghost's meticulousness, she now saw, was not about helping her, but about concealing her. Her laundry was folded, not for her convenience, but so that no stray sock lay exposed. Her books were aligned not for aesthetic pleasure, but so that no gap remained in the shelf, no hidden space could be glimpsed. The lavender scent wasn't a comforting aroma. It was a powerful masking agent, a desperate attempt to drown out other, more unsettling smells that now, with her senses heightened by fear, she began to perceive. A faint, metallic tang, like old blood or rust. A dusty, dry smell, like an ancient, undisturbed earth. The sounds from within the walls became more distinct. Scuttling, clicking, a soft, scraping whisper that sounded almost like someone dragging their fingers along a rough surface. Elara started to feel eyes upon her, not the benevolent gaze of her gentle ghost, but something cold, analytical, something that watched from the dark crevices between the plaster and the brick. She'd be sitting, reading a book, and a sudden drop in temperature would sweep through the room, accompanied by the distinct feeling of being observed. She'd glance up, and in the periphery of her vision, catch a fleeting shadow, gone before she could properly focus. The apartment, once her sanctuary, transformed into a cage. The gentle ghost's actions, once comforting, now filled her with terror. It was not caring for her. It was hiding her. It was attempting to make her quiet, to make her neat, to make her disappear. It was trying to tell her something, silently, desperately. The ghost wasn't haunting the apartment. It was hiding in it, terrified of something else that lived in the walls. Something that had lived there for a very, very long time. And now, thanks to Alara's presence, its hunger had been stirred. It was beginning to notice the new, living tenant. One morning, Alara found a small, fragile porcelain doll she'd cherished since childhood, positioned meticulously on her pillow. Its tiny, painted eyes seemed to stare directly at her. But one of its delicate ceramic legs was snapped cleanly in half, the break too precise to be accidental. And beside it, a small, dark, glistening smear on the white pillowcase. Not paint. It smelled of that metallic tang she'd come to dread. The lavender scent was absent, completely gone, replaced by the earthy, metallic smell, now strong enough to make her stomach churn. That night, the sounds from the walls intensified. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, moving from one wall to another, like something vast and heavy shifting just beyond her sight. She could hear the distinct sound of wood splintering, of plaster crumbling. Her gentle ghost, it seemed, was fighting. Or perhaps it was trying to escape. Or worst of all, it was trying to lead the other presence away from her. The clatter of objects in the next room, then a low, guttural moan that was not human, not animal, but something else entirely. Something ancient and hungry. Alara knew she had to leave. The apartment was no longer safe. It was a hunting ground, and she was the prey. She gathered only what she could carry. Her worn backpack, her wallet, her phone. She moved quietly, carefully, her heart pounding a frantic drum against her ribs as she crept through the shadowed hallway towards the front door. She heard a sound from her studio, a desperate thud, then a frantic, almost human sob, thin and ethereal. It was her gentle ghost, no longer attempting to hide her, but trying to warn her, trying to give her a chance. The sounds behind her grew louder, closer, a slithering, wet sound. The metallic tang in the air became unbearable, sharp and suffocating. She fumbled with the locks, her fingers clumsy with fear. Just as the final bolt clicked open, she felt a sudden, icy gust of wind sweep past her, and the front door slammed shut behind her, propelled by an unseen force. On the other side, she heard a horrifying crash, a sound of wood tearing apart, and then, mercifully, silence. Alara didn't look back. She ran down the 4 flights of stairs, her feet barely touching the steps, until she burst out onto the deserted street, gasping for breath, the cool night air a welcome balm on her feverish skin. She never returned to the apartment, never tried to retrieve her belongings, never spoke of what she had experienced inside those ancient walls. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, when the world is still and sleep is elusive, she swears she catches the faint, unmistakable scent of lavender, a silent, sorrowful farewell from a gentle spirit trapped, or perhaps finally consumed by the terrors lurking in the depths of that old city apartment. And she wonders, with a chill that runs bone deep, if the other presence ever truly gave up its hunt, or if it simply found a new, quiet place to wait. Ninth story, The Scent of the Last Dream. It began subtly, as all insidious things do. A wisp of something utterly alien, yet strangely familiar, in the quiet aftermath of a dream. Not a nightmare, not precisely, though the residue it left behind was far more chilling than any monster could have been. There was no terror in the waking, no frantic gasp for air, just an immense, crushing weight of forgotten horror. A profound, aching emptiness where memories should have been, leaving only the ghost of an experience, like the faint echo of a distant, impossible scream. And the scent. It was a peculiar alchemy, unlike anything Elias had ever encountered. Predominantly, there was the rich, earthy dampness of freshly turned soil, heavy and fecund, as if unearthed from depths no gardener's spade had ever reached. Intertwined with this was the sharp, metallic tang of ozone, the kind that slices through the air moments after lightning cracks the sky, carrying with it a charge of raw, untamed energy. But then, layered beneath these, was something sweeter, almost cloying, the unmistakable aroma of burnt sugar, caramelized to a bitter crisp, a sickly sweet char that lingered on the palate of his mind. He woke to it first in his bedroom, a faint presence that he initially dismissed as a forgotten candle, perhaps, or a strange residue from his laundry. He pushed back the duvet, the scent seeming to cling to the sheets, to the very air around his pillow. He sat up, shaking his head, trying to clear the mental fog that often followed particularly vivid, yet unremembered dreams. But the scent remained. It wasn't strong enough to be overwhelming, merely persistent, a quiet hum in the background of senses. He went about his morning ritual, brewing coffee, toasting bread. The scent followed. It mingled with the steam of his coffee, giving the rich, dark brew an unsettling, almost chemical undertone. He could taste the burnt sugar on his tongue, a phantom sweetness that turned his breakfast into ash in his mouth. He opened the window, hoping to air out the apartment, to dilute the phantom fragrance with the crisp morning air. But the breeze, when it stirred the curtains, seemed to carry the scent into the room, rather than dispersing it. It felt as though the very air outside was impregnated with it. For days, the scent became his constant, unwelcome companion. It clung to his clothes, a subtle miasma that no amount of washing could eradicate. He would pull a freshly laundered shirt from the dryer, and there it would be, that odd trinity of damp soil, ozone, and burnt sugar, woven into the fabric. People didn't seem to notice it. He would discreetly sniff his sleeve, then lean closer to a colleague, trying to detect a reaction, but their faces remained impassive. Was it only his nose that perceived this unsettling perfume? The thought gnawed at him. He became hyper-aware, sniffing the air like a hound, constantly trying to pinpoint its source. He checked his potted plants for strange molds, his electrical outlets for signs of burning wires. He even searched his cupboards for forgotten sweets that might have caramelized and scorched. Nothing. The apartment was clean, the plants healthy, the wiring sound. Yet the scent remained, an invisible shroud wrapped around his existence. It was during a particularly mundane afternoon, as he sat at his desk, typing out an email, that the true, terrifying realization began to dawn. He had taken a sip of water, and it tasted faintly of that acrid sweetness. He had leaned back in his chair, and the cushions exhaled a puff of damp earth and ozone. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, and felt a sudden, visceral jolt. It wasn't just in the room, or on him. It felt like it was from him, like it had seeped into his very pores. He remembered the dream, or rather, he remembered the feeling of the dream, that profound, unsettling blankness. And then, a flicker, a sensation of being somewhere dark, moist, and electrically charged, a place where something sweet had been destroyed. The scent. It wasn't random. It wasn't a domestic accident. It was a lingering remnant, a marker, a faint, almost imperceptible stain left behind from the place his mind had visited during that forgotten nightmare. The thought, once conceived, burrowed deep into his consciousness and began to sprout tendrils of icy dread. If the scent was a part of the dream, a souvenir, then what did it mean that it clung to him so persistently? Why hadn't it faded? Why, in fact, did it seem to be growing stronger, more defined with each passing hour? He started to connect the dots, terrifyingly. The dream, the memory of which remained a blank slate, was nevertheless powerful enough to leave a physical residue. And that residue, that unholy fragrance, was not diminishing. It was intensifying. He smelled it when he breathed, when he ate, when he walked down the street. The wind carried it from unknown directions, swirling it around him, then pressing it back onto his skin. A new, more chilling thought began to take root. What if the dream wasn't just a random, chaotic firing of neurons? What if the place in the dream, the source of that unholy scent, wasn't just a construct of his subconscious? What if it was real? And what if, upon his abrupt departure from it, it had somehow, inexplicably, remembered him? The idea was absurd, fantastical, yet it resonated with a deep, primal fear that twisted his gut. The scent wasn't just a byproduct. It was a calling card, a beacon, a whisper from a forgotten realm, reaching out across the threshold of sleep, trying to pull him back. Sleep, once a cherished escape, became a terrifying prospect. He fought it. He stayed up late, fueled by caffeine and a desperate, gnawing anxiety. He cleaned his apartment obsessively, scrubbing surfaces, airing out every corner, as if by removing every trace of dust, he could somehow scour away the invisible tether that bound him to that unseen place. He changed his bedding daily, bought new clothes, even tried different soaps and perfumes, hoping to overwhelm the clinging fragrance with something, anything else. It was futile. The scent remained, a stubborn, pervasive entity. It was in him now, he was convinced, a part of his very being. The days blurred into a sleepless haze of paranoia. Every shadow seemed to deepen. Every creak of the floorboards echoed with unseen intent. He began to see patterns in the way the scent intensified. It was strongest when he was tired, when his body yearned for rest. It grew more potent as darkness fell, as the world outside hushed itself, preparing for the realm of dreams. He'd lie in bed, rigid, staring at the ceiling, the unholy aroma thick in the air, a suffocating blanket, damp soil, reminding him of graves or forgotten crypts, ozone, sharp and electrifying, hinting at a power beyond comprehension, and burnt sugar, that sickening sweetness, a promise of decay, of something precious turned foul. Sometimes, just as consciousness began to fray at the edges, he he would feel a faint tug. Not physical, but something akin to a subtle shift in atmospheric pressure, a gentle suction from within his own mind. And with it, the scent would flare, potent and overwhelming, dragging him deeper. He would gasp, pull himself back, his heart hammering against his ribs, his body slick with cold sweat. He tried to talk about it, to friends, to his doctor. But how do you describe a haunting by a smell? How do you explain the terror of a forgotten dream reaching out to claim you? They looked at him with concern, prescribed him sedatives, suggested stress leave. He refused the sedatives. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that surrendering to sleep was the last thing he could do. One evening, exhausted beyond all endurance, he found himself staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale and drawn. He lifted his hand to his face, and for the first time, he thought he saw something in his eyes. Not reflections, but fleeting, almost subliminal images. Dark, shifting shapes. Glimpses of what looked like enormous, gnarled roots, wet with an unknown moisture. A flash of something bright, then gone, like a spark of lightning across a vast, desolate plain. And for a split second, a hint of something crystalline and scorched, almost like melted sugar frozen into grotesque forms. He recoiled, stumbling back from the mirror, his breath catching in his throat. The scent in the bathroom was so intense now, it was almost visible, a shimmering distortion in the air. It felt as though the very walls were weeping it, exhaling the essence of that forgotten place. His fear mutated from a gnawing anxiety into a primal terror. The dream wasn't just remembering him, it was actively reaching for him. The scent was its lure, its patiently laid trap. Every time he drifted towards sleep, the scent intensified, becoming a funnel, pulling him faster, deeper, into the maw of the forgotten. He barricaded himself in his waking hours, refusing to close his eyes, desperate to avoid the inevitable descent. He paced his apartment, the floorboards groaning under his endless circuit. The scent, once subtle, was now a constant, oppressive presence, like a damp, heavy cloak wrapped around his head. He tasted it on his tongue, breathed it into his lungs, felt it sting his eyes. It was no longer just a smell. It was an environment, his environment. The world outside his window began to feel distant, muted, as if separated from him by a thick, fragrant pane of glass. He saw people walking, cars driving, but they were shadows, faint echoes of a reality that no longer truly touched him. His reality was shrinking, contracting to the confines of his apartment, and within it, to the suffocating embrace of the scent. He knew it was a losing battle. The human body could only endure so much. Sleep, the great equalizer, would eventually claim him. And when it did, he knew, with a chilling certainty, that he wouldn't just be dreaming. He would be returning to the place from which the scent originated, the place that remembered him, the place that waited. As the first faint streaks of dawn began to lighten the sky outside his window, Elias slumped onto his bed, too exhausted to fight any longer. His eyelids felt like lead. The scent was overwhelming now, a suffocating embrace of damp earth, crackling ozone, and sickeningly sweet char. It wasn't just around him. It was within him, a part of his very marrow. He felt the gentle tug again, stronger this time, an irresistible pull. He didn't fight it. He couldn't. His last conscious thought, before the darkness swallowed him whole, was of the scent. Not with terror, but with a strange, numb acceptance. He knew where he was going. He just didn't know if he would ever truly wake up again. The scent of the last dream had finally claimed its dreamer. 10th story, The Rule of the Woods, Entry 1, August 14th, Log Entry, August 14th. Dr. Aris Thorne, commencing preliminary observations at the Blackwood National Park Research Outpost. My objective? A comprehensive, longitudinal study of localized animal behavioral patterns with a specific focus on interspecies communication and response to environmental stimuli. The park is, frankly, breathtaking. Old-growth forest, a patchwork of towering pines and ancient deciduous trees, unbroken for miles. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. Equipment set up, sensors deployed. The automated recording systems are online. Early data indicates typical activity. Deer grazing in the twilight. A chorus of crickets and frogs at dusk. The distinct hoot of a great horned owl echoing through the canopy. Baseline established. Excitement is high. This is precisely the kind of undisturbed environment I'd hoped for. The solitude is a welcome change from the cacophony of urban life, and the sheer vibrancy of the ecosystem is invigorating. I've already spotted a family of raccoons near the stream bed, meticulously washing what appeared to be berries, and witnessed a spectacular aerial display from a red-tailed hawk circling high above the eastern ridge. Everything, so far, is wonderfully, predictably natural. Entry 2, August 28th. 2 weeks in, and the initial data is robust. I'm recording fascinating nuances in deer migratory paths, subtle shifts in birdsong correlating with changes in atmospheric pressure, and even some intriguing patterns in insect swarms during specific humidity levels. This park is a gold mine for an ethologist. However, I've noted a peculiar anomaly, minor but repetitive enough to merit logging. On 3 separate occasions now, for periods ranging from 10 to 30 seconds, I've observed a complete cessation of movement across multiple species within my immediate observational zone. The first time, it was a group of sparrows mid-flight, simply stopped, like a glitch in a recording. They hung there, perfectly still, before resuming their trajectory as if nothing had happened. The second, a foraging squirrel on a tree trunk, its paw poised midair, frozen. The third, a deer in the clearing, its head lifted, ears twitching, then utterly rigid. In all instances, the environment itself seemed to hold its breath. No wind rustled leaves, no distant bird call. A profound, unnatural silence. Then, as quickly as it began, it ended. My hypothesis? A localized, ultra-low frequency sound pulse, perhaps geophysical in origin, outside human auditory range, but disruptive to animal nervous systems. I've recalibrated my acoustic sensors to detect anything below 20 Hz. It's certainly unusual, but I've encountered stranger things in the field. I'm eager to capture this event with the updated equipment. The scientific mind demands an explanation, and I am determined to find it. Entry 3, September 5th. The anomaly is persisting, and my initial hypothesis regarding low-frequency sound pulses has yielded no corroborating data. The new sensors detect nothing unusual during these stasis events, and they are happening with increasing frequency and, disturbingly, duration. Today, a flock of crows I was tracking froze for nearly 2 minutes, not just motionless, but utterly devoid of any vital sign I could detect from my distance. No flutter of a feather, no visible breath. When they resumed, it was instantaneous. as if an invisible pause button had been released. What's even more unsettling is the sheer synchronicity. It's not just a single species. This morning, I observed a cardinal, a chipmunk, and a cluster of gnats, all within the same visual frame, halt at precisely the same second. Then, after what felt like an eternity, but was, in fact, 4 minutes and 13 seconds by my timer, they all unfroze simultaneously. The suddenness of it is jarring. It's not a startled freeze, not a predator-induced paralysis. There's no visible trigger, no sound, no sudden shadow. It's as if an invisible hand reaches out and simply stops the world for these creatures. I am beginning to discard the environmental trigger theory. This feels different, more intentional, less like a natural phenomenon, and more like a command. The hair on my arms raises as I write that word. A command. But from whom or what? The scientific method demands I remain objective, but my instincts are starting to scream. Entry 4, September 18th. The events are no longer anomalies. They are the new normal. I've started calling it the rule, because it feels like a rule, an unspoken, unseen directive. And every living creature in this forest, save for me, seems to be obeying it. The durations are escalating. Yesterday, a family of bears, a sow, and 2 cubs remained frozen for almost an hour. An entire hour in the middle of a stream, mid-stride. No perceptible breath. No blinking. Their eyes, wide and glassy, seemed to stare past me into some unseen dimension. I approached cautiously, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could have touched them. They were statues. Perfect, breathing, living statues. My own breath hitched in my throat just watching them. When the rule lifted, they simply continued their crossing as if no time had passed. No confusion, no disorientation, just seamless resumption. This synchronicity is defying all known biological principles. Animals don't just stop their metabolic processes like this without consequence. And the sheer scope of it. It's not just the larger animals, even the insects. I've seen ants frozen on their trails, spiders mid-web building, moths on the wing. It's universal. My rational mind is struggling. I've reviewed every piece of data, every sensor reading. No seismic activity, no unusual atmospheric pressure, no electromagnetic fluctuations. Nothing. It's as if the trigger isn't physical. It's something else. I've begun to feel a prickle on the back of my neck during these silences. A sense of immense, oppressive stillness that extends beyond the visible creatures. It's not just the animals that are quiet. The very air becomes thick, heavy, as if it too is holding its breath. I find myself holding mine as well, involuntarily. I'm starting to wonder if the rule applies to everything but me. And why? Am I being observed? Tested? The solitude, once a comfort, is beginning to feel like isolation, and the silence is becoming a weight. Entry 5, October 3rd. I'm starting to feel increasingly exposed. The rule is a constant presence now. It can strike at any moment, without warning. I spend my days on edge, constantly scanning the forest, not just for animal behavior, but for the telltale sign of the world suddenly stopping. The longer the events last, the more unnerving become. Today, a 5-hour freeze, a vast portion of the forest, utterly motionless. I moved carefully during this period, testing the boundaries. I tried to disrupt a frozen robin, gently nudging it with a stick. It remained rigid, unyielding, like petrified wood. No response whatsoever. It was horrifying. It looked alive, but it wasn't responding to anything external. It was trapped. I've begun to theorize that the rule is not a response to a trigger, but an enforcement by a presence, an awareness. It feels like a silent, omnipresent hunter, observing, waiting, and its gaze causes this unnatural stillness. The thought sends a shiver down my spine that has nothing to do with the autumn chill. I've considered packing up, but a strange, terrifying curiosity holds me here. I need to understand. I have to. What is this presence? What does it want? And why am I seemingly exempt? The exemption feels less like a privilege and more like a terrifying vulnerability. If everything else is freezing, what happens if I'm caught moving? What kind of power is this that can simply stop life? The questions are consuming me. My sleep is restless, plagued by visions of a world frozen solid, save for my own terrified, beating heart. The forest, once a sanctuary, now feels like a vast, open trap. Entry 6, October 17th. The fear is becoming primal. It's a cold, creep-in dread that settles in my bones. I've begun to notice patterns in the lack of patterns. The rule doesn't seem to have a fixed schedule or duration. It's random, arbitrary. This randomness is a weapon in itself, ensuring constant vigilance, constant anxiety. My research notes are becoming less scientific observations and more desperate attempts to categorize the uncanny. I've been testing my own reactions. During these stasis events, I force myself to remain still for extended periods, trying to mimic the animals. It's excruciating. My muscles cramp, my eyes water, but the urge to move, to twitch, to even breathe too deeply is almost unbearable. I imagine the presence observing, a silent, invisible gaze, testing my obedience. The question of why I'm not affected haunts me. Is it because I'm human? Or because I'm aware of the rule? Perhaps the creatures aren't merely freezing. Perhaps they are choosing to freeze, instinctively, to avoid something worse. The thought is a venomous one, poisoning my resolve. What could be worse than prolonged metabolic stasis? What kind of consequences does this rule carry for those who break it? I've seen no signs of violence, no bodies of animals caught in movement during a freeze. But the absolute obedience, the universal compliance, speaks volumes. It implies a penalty so severe that every instinct, every drive is overridden by the need for stillness. My supplies are dwindling. The last resupply drop isn't for another 3 weeks. I feel like I'm trapped in a vast, silent play, and I'm the only actor who doesn't know the script. Or worse, I'm the only audience member, witnessing a performance meant for no human eyes. The constant vigilance is exhausting. My hands tremble as I write this. I heard something today, during a freeze. A faint, almost imperceptible hum in the silence. It wasn't my equipment. It wasn't a natural sound. It was like a vibration in the air itself, the sound of immense, unfathomable power. And it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Entry 7, October 30th. The hum is growing more frequent, more distinct. It accompanies every rule event now, a low, resonant thrumming that seems to vibrate through the very ground. It's not loud, but it's pervasive, a constant, unsettling underscore to the unnatural silences. I tried to pinpoint its origin, but it dissipates the moment the freeze lifts. It's like the sound of the presence itself, a silent roar that only manifests when the world holds its breath. My paranoia is escalating. I find myself whispering to myself, just to break the silence. During the freezes, I watch the animals with a morbid fascination. Their glassy eyes seem to follow me, even though I know they can't. They look not afraid, not peaceful, but utterly, completely compliant, resigned. I attempted an experiment today. During a freeze, a short one, only 15 minutes, I tried to move an earthworm. I found one exposed on a damp log. As the hum began and the surrounding crickets fell silent, I picked it up. It was stiff, unyielding, but not dead. I held it in my palm. The moment the hum ceased, it twitched, then resumed its slow, undulating movement, as if nothing had happened. No visible harm. So the consequence isn't immediate death. But what then? What if the rule is a form of selection, a test, or something far more insidious? The thought that I am being observed, judged by this unseen force, is becoming unbearable. I've been sleeping less and less, often spending entire nights huddled in my cabin, bathed in the glow of my laptop, reviewing data that tells me nothing useful. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside, sends a jolt of adrenaline through me. I'm no longer studying the forest, or something within it, is studying me. I feel like prey, even though nothing is actively hunting. The threat is in the stillness, in the waiting. And I know, with a terrifying certainty, that my exemption from the rule won't last forever. The silence is not empty. It is pregnant with anticipation. Entry 8, November 10th, my last audio entry. The generator is sputtering. Fuel is almost gone. My internal battery is running low as well. The rule is now almost continuous. Brief periods of normal activity interspersed with increasingly long freezes. Yesterday, an entire afternoon. 6 hours. The hum was constant, vibrating through the walls of the cabin, through my teeth, into my very bones. It felt like I was inside a tuning fork of dread. I made a terrible discovery. During the 6-hour freeze, out of an overwhelming, morbid compulsion, I walked deeper into the forest than I ever had during an event. I saw them. The rule breakers, not animals, but remnants, deformed, twisted forms, integrated into the very structure of the trees and rocks. They weren't dead, not in a traditional sense, more like fused. Like they had been caught in motion, mid-stride, mid-flight, and then simply solidified into the landscape. A deer half emerged from a boulder, its antlers like petrified branches. A bird, its wings outstretched, seemingly woven into the bark of an oak. They weren't skeletons. They were perfect, detailed forms, as if sculpted from the earth itself. They were the ultimate punishment for defying the rule: absorption, assimilation into the silent, unmoving world. My stomach churned, and I almost vomited. This isn't just about freezing. It's about becoming the forest, becoming part of the rule, forever. And the worst part, they weren't just animals. I saw faint, human-like outlines, twisted, distorted, but unmistakably human. Old explorers, lost hikers, people who didn't understand the rule or couldn't obey it. They had tried to move, and they paid the ultimate price. I fled back to the cabin, my mind screaming. This presence isn't just stopping things, it's absorbing them. It's a silent, living architect, building its dominion out of disobedience. I understand now. The animals aren't freezing to escape harm. They are freezing to avoid this, to avoid becoming a permanent, grotesque monument to their own defiance. I heard the hum begin again as I reached the cabin door. My heart leapt into my throat. It was longer this time, deeper. more resonant. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absolute, suffocating presence of something vast and ancient. I looked out the window. The trees, the bushes, the birds on the feeder, all still. Even the dust motes in the air seemed to hang suspended. Everything was frozen. Everything but me. I gripped the microphone, my hand shaking so violently I could barely hold it steady. I can feel it now, this incredible pressure, this urge to be still, to become one with the quiet. My muscles are tightening. My breath is catching. It's not just around me anymore. It's inside me. A cold, creeping paralysis. I can't move. I have to stay still. I have to obey. This is Dr. Aris Thorne. Logging. Final. Entry. I think I can hear the hum. It's getting closer. The rule is here. I can't move. The fire is now fading to embers. The tales are told. And for those of you still with me, still floating in the dark between wakefulness and sleep, I have one last question. If you're still awake, let me know in the comments. Which of these stories will linger with you the most as you finally drift off? Until we gather again, sleep well and sweet dreams.